Tonight, I want to tell you about 7 members of the Jedi High Council who survived Order 66, the night in 19 BBY, when the Jedi Order was almost completely extinguished across the galaxy in a matter of hours. It is a story I keep coming back to because it looks at first like a simple catastrophe, a sudden and total collapse, and becomes stranger the closer you hold it to the light. Because survival in that moment was not a matter of strength or skill or even awareness, though those things mattered. It was almost entirely a matter of accident, of being in the wrong place at the right time, of a communication delay or a starfighter malfunction or a single moment of warning in the Force that came just soon enough. The Jedi Order, when it fell, numbered roughly 10,000 strong across the galaxy, 10,000 beings trained in the ways of the Force, bound together by centuries of tradition and purpose and mutual connection. Within a single night, almost all of them would be dead. Over the coming chapters, we will walk through how that happened, how the Clone Wars ground on for 3 years, how the cracks formed in the Order's foundation, how one man engineered the entire collapse and positioned himself perfectly to take power. But first, we need to stand in the moment itself, to understand what it felt like when the impossible became real, when the ones the clones called their generals turned around and executed the people they had fought beside for years. So let me take you back to 19 BBY, to the night the galaxy burned. On the planet Coruscant, the capital world of the Republic, Supreme Chancellor Sheev Palpatine stood in his office high above the city, having just electrocuted Jedi Master Mace Windu, one of the 12 members of the High Council, and watched as Anakin Skywalker, the Jedi Knight chosen as the Chosen One, cut off Windu's hand and let him fall to his death. In that moment, Anakin stepped fully into the darkness, and Palpatine, secretly the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, made a single transmission to the clone commanders scattered across 10,000 worlds. Execute Order 66, he told them, his voice calm and clear. All Jedi are traitors to the Republic. Execute them immediately. And across the galaxy, something activated in the minds of millions of soldiers. Not a choice, not an order they could refuse, but a compulsion written into their very biology, implanted during their creation on the water world of Camino years before, waiting for this moment like a bomb with a delayed fuse. The clone troopers, soldiers who had fought alongside their Jedi generals for 3 long years, suddenly found they could not do anything but obey. On Coruscant itself, the seat of Jedi power, Anakin Skywalker walked into the Jedi Temple at the head of the 501st Legion, the unit he had commanded throughout the Clone Wars, the soldiers who loved him and trusted him, and he began to execute everyone inside. The senior masters, the knights, the apprentices, even the children being trained in the ways of the Force. The temple's battlemaster, Sin Dralig, tried to resist and was cut down by the man he had served. Young Zet Jukasa, a Padawan barely old enough to call himself a Jedi, was gunned down by clones outside the temple while Senator Bail Organa watched in horror from a distance, understanding in that moment that something catastrophic had shifted in the galaxy. And in the temple's communication chamber, someone activated a recall beacon, a distress signal that would draw any surviving Jedi back to the temple like moths to a flame. Except it was not a beacon of hope, but a trap, a tool to gather the remaining Jedi in one place where they could be destroyed more efficiently. But across the galaxy, on 1,000 different worlds, the same scene was playing out with minor variations. On the planet Utapau, where Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi had just defeated the separatist General Grievous in combat, Commander Cody, the clone officer who had fought at Obi-Wan's side, suddenly received the transmission and turned his blaster on his general. Obi-Wan sensed the betrayal coming and threw himself from a cliff into the water below, escaping by sheer chance, with nothing but the clothes on his back and the growing certainty that something had gone horrifyingly wrong. On Maijito, a frozen mining world in the outer reaches, the Galactic Marines under Commander Bakara gunned down Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi as he stood among them, a sudden and complete betrayal from the soldiers he had led. On Felucia, a jungle world thick with strange flora, Jedi Master Arilla Secura was shot in the back by her own troops under Commander Bly. Shot so many times she fell before she even understood what was happening. On Salukami, Jedi Master Stas Ali, speeding across the landscape on a BARC speeder, was blown out of the sky by blaster fire from the clones she had trusted, crashing into the dust below. On Kato Nemoidia, Jedi Master Plo Koon's starfighter was torn apart by clone pilots he had commanded, and he fell burning through the atmosphere. On Kashyyyk, the tree-covered homeworld of the Wookiees, something different happened, something that would matter very much to the survival of the Order. Master Yoda, oldest of the Jedi, wisest of them all, was standing among the Wookiees as the clone Commander Gree received the transmission and turned his weapon on the ancient Jedi. But Yoda, with the instincts honed over more than 900 years of life and study of the Force, felt the shift before it happened, sensed the sudden swell of rage and murder in the minds of his soldiers, and he moved with a speed and grace that belied his age, his lightsaber igniting and cutting through the clones before they could fire. 2 of them fell, and Yoda escaped into the forests and swamps of Kashyyyk with the help of Wookiee allies, disappearing into the wilderness with his life still intact. And in the temple on Coruscant, as the 501st killed their way through the halls, and the youngest members of the Order died not understanding why, the recall beacon continued to broadcast its false message of safety to any Jedi who might be listening, drawing them toward the one place in the galaxy where they had the least chance of survival. But not all of the Jedi would answer that call. Some, by accident or instinct, or the simple fact that they were far enough away to receive warning before the slaughter came, would escape into hiding. They would be scattered across the galaxy, isolated from each other, hunted by an enemy with unlimited resources and the power of an empire at its back. Most of them would not survive. But 7 of the 12 High Council members would make it through that terrible night. 7 survivors who would carry the weight of what had been lost and the fragile hope of what might one day be rebuilt. And over the next while, we are going to trace the path of each of them, how they fell, how they survived, what they carried with them into the darkness, and the strange and distant legacy they would leave behind. So settle in, and let me take you back a little further, to the moment before the fall, when the Jedi Order still stood at its peak, when no one yet knew what was coming. In the last days before everything fell apart, there was a moment, just a moment, when the Jedi Order stood at the peak of its power, and almost no one alive understood that they were standing on the edge of a cliff. To see them clearly, you have to travel backward in time, back 3 years, to 22 BBY, to the day the Clone Wars began, when the Order still believed it had a future. The Jedi High Council met in a circular chamber at the crown of the temple's central spire, overlooking all of Coruscant, that endless city of light and steel that went down into darkness below the clouds. 12 seats arranged in a careful circle, 12 beings of different worlds and species, each one a master of the Force, each one carrying decades or centuries of weight. At the head of them, though head was not quite how the Jedi understood hierarchy, was Yoda. Small, ancient, almost 900 years old, his green skin like weathered leather, his ears long and expressive. He had walked the halls of the Jedi Temple when it was young, had trained Padawans whose names were dust now, had seen the Order through wars and schisms, and the slow, patient erosion of the Force's connection to the galaxy. There was no one in the chamber, no one in the entire Order, who carried the weight he carried. Beside him, and yet not beside him, for the circle had no sides in the way an ordinary room has sides, was Mace Windu, broad-shouldered, dark-skinned, a human from Harun Kal who had forged a path through the Force the way others forged metal. He carried a lightsaber with a blade of unusual purple, and he had helped create a form of combat so dangerous that its mastery was trusted to almost no one. Varpad, a technique that walked the line between control and aggression, that could only be wielded by someone with absolute discipline and iron certainty in their choices. There was no one alive who wielded it better than Mace Windu, and you understood, looking at him, that he had spent his whole life learning how to stand in that narrow space. Plo Koon was there, a Kel Dor from the planet Dorin, his face wrapped in a breathing mask, his eyes covered by protective goggles, because he came from a world where the air itself was poison to most species, and he had learned early that survival sometimes meant carrying your home with you. He had a gift for finding potential, a way of seeing what others missed. It was Plo Koon who had walked into a monastery one day and recognized a child named Ahsoka Tano, who saw in her the spark of something extraordinary and brought her to the temple to be trained. Ki-Adi-Mundi sat with the distinctive long, narrow head of a Sarian, his body the peculiar architecture of a being with a binary brain, two centers of consciousness learning to think as one, which meant that even among the council, he carried a kind of duality that others could not quite fathom. Kit Fisto was there, a Nautolan whose skin was the green of deep water and whose head tentacles moved with a kind of liquid grace, and he was smiling. Kit Fisto was almost always smiling, a genuine expression of warmth toward the Force and toward others that somehow made him neither naive nor less formidable. Shark T arrived bearing the distinctive silhouette of a Togruta, her Montral and Leku, the head-tails of her species, rising in crimson and cream, and she carried herself with the careful precision of someone who had learned to move in the presence of power without flinching. Cece Tien was Eric Tochi, distinguished by the large, downturned horns that framed his face, and he had spent his life in the void between worlds, piloting starfighters with an instinct that seemed almost like reading the future, as though the Force moved through his hands into the controls of a ship. The chamber held Eth Koth, whose face bore the horns and ritual tattoos of his Zabrak heritage, Adi Gallia, Agent Kola, Coleman Treba with the peculiar physiology of the Verk, Depa Balaba, who had once been Mace Windu's own Padawan and now sat as his equal, Oppo Rancises with his serpentine lower body, the small and scar-marked Even Peel, and Yaddle, who shared Yoda's species and seemed to carry something of his ancient wisdom in her own quiet way. To be in that chamber was to stand in the presence of the accumulated knowledge of the Order, millennia of teaching, discipline, connection to the Force that most beings in the galaxy could not even comprehend. And yet, 3 years before this peace would end in blood, the Council did not know what they could not see. They sat in their circle on the day the Clone Wars began, at the Battle of Geonosis, when Mace Windu led 200 Jedi into an arena on a desert world to save 3 of their own, not understanding that they were walking into a moment that would redefine everything they were. Yoda arrived with the clone army, a military force conjured from nothing, created in secret on the ocean world of Kamino, commissioned in the name of a dead Jedi Master, now revealed all at once as the Republic's salvation against the Separatist threat. And in that moment, something shifted in the Order's understanding of itself. For the first time in 1,000 years, the Jedi were not peacekeepers and teachers and negotiators. They became generals, commanding soldiers, leading armies across 10,000 worlds in a war that Supreme Chancellor Palpatine assured them would be brief, decisive, and necessary. The Council accepted this transformation because they believed they saw no alternative, because the threat was real, because the Force itself seemed to be drawing them toward this path. What they did not see, and what I find myself thinking about now, is that they were being moved like pieces on a game board by a player whose position they could not perceive. The man they served, Palpatine, courteous and concerned and always reasonable, was not what he appeared to be. He was a Sith Lord, the first in 1,000 years, and he had orchestrated the entire war from beginning to end, positioning the Jedi where they needed to be destroyed, embedding soldiers with an obedience they could not resist, waiting with the patience of the damned for the moment when he could give a single order and unmake them all. But on that day in 22 BBY, sitting in their circle at the crown of the temple, the Council did not know any of this. They knew only that the Order had been called to war, that the Force was with them, that they were more powerful than they had ever been, and that they were walking blindly into the gravity well of their own destruction. There is something almost unbearable in holding both truths at once, seeing them in their moment of greatest strength, and knowing that the very thing that gave them that strength was the thing that would kill them. But that is the shape of the story, and it is the only way to understand what comes next. There is a being in this story whose name you likely know, even if you have never heard it spoken aloud. Yoda, the Grand Master, the oldest thing alive in a galaxy of billions, small enough to fit in the palm of an outstretched hand and ancient beyond the reckoning of most species. He was not born into the Jedi Order. No one knows where he came from or what species he belongs to, or how long his people live in their uncharted corner of the galaxy somewhere beyond the mapped worlds. The canonical records do not tell us these things, and perhaps it is right that they don't. Some mysteries are the price of longevity. What we know is that for 800 years, Yoda had trained Jedi. 8 centuries. Not commanded them, not studied them, not advised them, trained them. One generation after another, walking the temple corridors with a wooden cane, watching them learn to still their minds and ignite their blades, seeing each young initiate's fear and potential laid bare before him like an open book. That span of time is almost incomprehensible to us. It is longer than most civilizations last. It is longer than most religions. But for Yoda, it was simply the arc of a life lived in service to something he believed in absolutely. There is something I find myself thinking about a lot. What does it cost a being to carry that much memory, that much accumulated knowledge of how many ways a Jedi can fail? To have trained not hundreds but thousands, and to remember each of them, their names, their struggles, the particular shape of their fear or their gift. He was small, physically, only about 66 centimeters tall, which is to say he barely reached the height of a human child. And by the time of the Clone Wars, he walked with a Gaimer stick, a wooden cane that he leaned on with an almost grandfatherly gentleness. Yet in those small hands was a lightsaber, a short green blade that moved with a speed and agility that made him one of the finest duelists the Order had ever produced. When he fought, he abandoned the careful, defensive forms that one might expect of the aged. Instead, he moved in the acrobatic, explosive style called Ataru, Form IV, the method of the dancer and the acrobat, flipping and rolling and striking from angles that seemed to defy the simple fact of his size. It was as if 800 years of discipline had taught him not to resist his own smallness, but to make it a weapon. In 22 BBY, when the Clone Wars erupted on Geonosis, and the Jedi discovered that Palpatine had created a secret clone army for them, Yoda stood on that scarlet dust and faced Count Dooku, the man who had once been his own Padawan, his own student, whom he had trained and watched choose the darkness instead. The moment must have carried a weight that few of us can measure. Here was a student he had taught for decades, now turned to the Sith, serving the very same Palpatine who had orchestrated this war as a trap. Yoda deflected Dooku's force lightning as if batting away falling rain, and when Dooku tried to kill Anakin and Obi-Wan with a collapsing pillar, Yoda lifted it with a thought and held it suspended until his former student fled. Then he ordered the clone army forward into bat. For 3 years after that, Yoda served as a Jedi general, commanding troops across 1,000 worlds, watching the war grind on with no clear victor, stretching the Jedi Order thinner and thinner. And yet even as the galaxy burned around him, Yoda was becoming aware of something else, a disturbance he could not quite name, a shadow creeping across the Force itself. The Jedi Order was not just being tested, it was being hunted. In the final months before the end, Yoda undertook a sacred journey to learn a secret that only the wisest Jedi had ever known. The technique of persisting after death, of becoming a ghost in the Force, retaining one's identity even when the body falls. This was not about immortality in the conventional sense, not about refusing to die. It was about choosing what to carry forward. On this journey, guided by the voice of Qui-Gon Jinn, a Jedi Master who had learned this technique and was now reaching out from beyond death, Yoda went to Moraband, the ancient Sith homeworld, to the Valley of the Dark Lords. He confronted visions of Darth Bane, the Sith Lord who had written the rule of 2 centuries before, and he did not surrender to the darkness, but neither did he simply overpower it. He accepted it, learned from it, and came away with the knowledge that transformation, true transformation, required letting go not of power, but of the illusion that power could ever be held. There is something in that contrast that matters to dwell on. Yoda was not seeking a way to survive forever, or to escape death, or to maintain his dominion. He was seeking a way to remain useful after the body was gone, to be a guide, a memory, a presence for those who would come after. It is the inverse of grasping. It is the ultimate expression of what he had been teaching for 800 years, that the Force moves through us, not for us, and that wisdom is learning to align yourself with that movement rather than resist it. Then came 19 BBY and Order 66. Yoda was on Kashyyyk, the Wookiee homeworld, fighting alongside the native people against separatist invaders, when the inhibitor chip inside his clone commander activated and his own troops turned to kill him. But Yoda sensed the betrayal through the Force, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something he had already begun to understand. He beheaded both clones before they could fire, then escaped into the Wookiee forests with help from warriors like Chewbacca and Tarful. Yet even as he fled one world, something terrible was happening across the galaxy. Through the Force, Yoda felt it, a rupture so vast and sudden that it was almost incomprehensible. Thousands of Jedi dying at once, their presences snuffed out like candles in a storm. 10,000 years of the Order, crushed in an instant by the very people meant to fight beside them. When Yoda returned to Coruscant with Obi-Wan Kenobi, they found the temple burning. They watched security recordings of the temple's fall of Anakin Skywalker, the boy Yoda had always carried a doubt about, always sensed fear in, always warned against, walking through corridors of children with a lightsaber, extinguishing them. It was not a shock to Yoda in the way it might have been to others. Fear leads to anger, he had taught. Anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. He had watched Anakin's fear grow for years. He had warned the Council. They had overruled him, and now the consequences were written in blood. What came next was a duel between Yoda and Emperor Palpatine, Darth Sidious, in the Senate chamber, 2 ancient beings of power meeting in a space designed for speech and law, now become a chamber for combat. Yoda was not young, and Palpatine was something Yoda had not anticipated, not a hidden rival, but a presence that had reordered the very fabric of the Force itself. The duel lasted long enough for Yoda to know that he could not win it. He hurled Senate pods with force power that would have crushed ordinary beings, but Palpatine redirected them, and in the end, Yoda was forced to retreat, helped away by Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan. There is no shame in knowing when you have been beaten. There is only clarity. That clarity is what Yoda carried with him as he made his final choice: to go into exile, to disappear into a remote, forgotten place, to become a voice in the Force rather than a body in the galaxy. He chose Dagobah, a remote swamp world untouched by civilization, thick with the living Force, far from the great trade routes and the Emperor's reach. There he would wait and teach and remember. For 1,000 years had taught him that patience is not passivity. It is the deepest form of strength. You have to understand something about Obi-Wan Kenobi if you want to make sense of what came later. He was never supposed to be a great man. He was supposed to be a good student. In 32 BBY, when his master Qui-Gon Jinn walked into a duel with a Sith Lord named Darth Maul on the streets of Naboo, Obi-Wan was still a Padawan, still learning, still deferring to his teacher's judgment, still carrying the lightsaber that was not yet his own. Qui-Gon died that day, and in the moment of his death, He left Obi-Wan with a burden that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with promise. As Qui-Gon lay dying, he asked his student to do something. Train Anakin Skywalker, a boy he had found on a desert planet, a boy he believed was the chosen one. The Jedi Council didn't want to grant Anakin a spot in the Order. Anakin was too old, they said. He was too afraid, too angry, too bound up in attachment and desire. They could sense something in him that felt dangerous, fractured, a fault line running through his Force presence. But Qui-Gon had asked, and masters listened to their dying teachers, and so Obi-Wan, newly knighted after cutting Maul in half with his master's own blade, inherited not just grief but responsibility. There's something I want to dwell on here, because it matters for everything that follows. Obi-Wan accepted the task not because he felt equal to it, but because he was obligated. It was a promise made to a dying man, and in the Jedi Order, promises are the closest thing they have to sacred. For the next decade, Obi-Wan raised Anakin Skywalker, and it was, I think, harder than anyone who wasn't there could really understand. Anakin was brilliant, his reflexes, his instinctive connection to the Force, his ability to learn, all of it extraordinary. But he was also restless, ambitious, burning, with a need to be important that Obi-Wan, measured and careful as he was, could never fully satisfy. There was a friction between them that never quite resolved. A student who wanted to soar and a teacher bound by the Order's ancient rules, which said don't grow too attached, don't let yourself love them too much. Remember that the Force is what matters, not the individual. Obi-Wan tried to hold that balance, and he paid a price for trying. Then, in 22 BBY, the Clone Wars began. Obi-Wan was sent to the planet Kamino and found something that should have been impossible. An entire army, 10,000 clones, created from a template, built in secret, and apparently ordered by a Jedi Master named Sifo Dyas. Except Sifo Dyas was dead, and Obi-Wan had never approved any such thing. He traced the order back and found the bounty hunter Jango Fett, the genetic template for every clone trooper in that vast, hidden facility. And when he tracked Jango further, it led him to Geonosis, where the Separatists were waiting, where a trap was closing, where the war itself was born. The Jedi Council elevated him to the rank of Master. He became a general in the Grand Army of the Republic, commanding clone troopers with the designation 212th Attack Battalion, led by a commander named Cody, who had been made molecularly to follow him to the death. I think this is where you start to see the weight accumulating on Obi-Wan's shoulders in a way that his bearing never quite expressed. He was thoughtful, diplomatic, cautious. People called him the negotiator because he had a gift for seeing multiple sides of a conflict and finding the narrow ground between them. Anakin was becoming famous as well, celebrated as the hero with no fear, brilliant in battle, beloved by his troops, rising fast, always reaching for the next rung of power and prestige. And Obi-Wan had to keep training him, keep restraining him, keep trying to hold his student to the Order's path, even as the war ground on and on and on. For 3 years, 22 to 19 BBY, the Clone Wars raged across thousands of worlds, and in that grinding, endless conflict, Obi-Wan was forced to make decisions that had no good answer. He faced General Grievous, the Separatist cyborg commander, again and again, their duels becoming almost ritualized, each encounter a sort of dark mirror of Obi-Wan's own relationship with limitation and discipline. He crossed blades with Asajj Ventress, Count Dooku's assassin, trained in the dark side, and felt the pull of anger and despair that the Force can offer to those willing to embrace it. And then, in a moment that I think broke something in him that he never quite acknowledged, he learned that Darth Maul, the Sith Lord he had cut in half on Naboo a decade earlier, had survived, was still alive, was still hunting, was still carrying his hatred like a fixed star. When Maul came for him again during the war, it was not just about power or ideology. It was personal, and worse, Maul used what he knew about Obi-Wan against him. He found Duchess Satine Kryze, the leader of Mandalore, a woman Obi-Wan had loved, and he killed her in front of him, not because she was a threat, but because suffering was the point, because breaking Obi-Wan's composure was worth more to Maul than simple victory. There's a choice that moment represents that I want you to sit with for a moment. Obi-Wan could have given in to his rage, could have fallen into the dark side as Maul intended, could have let his pain transform into something hungry and violent. Instead, he went back to the Council, back to his duty, back to the impossible work of holding the Order together as it fractured under the strain of war. He even faked his own death once, went undercover as a bounty hunter named Rako Hardeen to prevent an assassination. Another burden, another layer of isolation, another secret kept. By the time 19 BBY arrived, and the war was reaching its climax, Obi-Wan had become someone very different from the young Padawan who grieved his master on Naboo. He was a council member now, trusted by Yoda, respected by his peers, a stabilizing force in an order that was becoming increasingly untethered from its own principles. But he was also exhausted, weary in a way that sleep couldn't touch, carrying the weight of promises made to dying men, of responsibilities he had never asked for, of a student he loved but could not save. And that was the state he was in when the final revelation came, when he discovered that Anakin, his Padawan, his years of careful teaching, had fallen to the dark side, had become the weapon that was being used to destroy everything Obi-Wan had ever protected. But that's a story for another moment. For now, know this. Obi-Wan Kenobi rose to the Council not because he sought greatness, but because the galaxy kept asking him to be greater than he believed he was. And he kept saying yes, kept carrying the burden, kept trying to hold the line, even as the line was collapsing around him. Over 3 years, from 22 BBY until the very edge of 19 BBY, the Clone Wars ground on without resolution. And this is the part of the story where you begin to understand how a great order can be slowly hollowed out, not by sudden violence, but by the weight of unending exhaustion. In the beginning, at Geonosis, there had been clarity, a single massive battle where the clone army was first deployed, where the Jedi stood together against the droid legions, where lines were drawn and the enemy named. But Geonosis was not an ending. It was a door opening onto something far longer and more terrible than anyone had anticipated. Across 1,000 worlds, Ryloth, Christophsis, Felucia, Maijito, Umbara, and countless others whose names would fade from memory, the Separatist forces and the Republic forces met and clashed and pulled apart and met again, without either side ever quite managing to destroy the other. The Confederacy of Independent Systems, publicly led by Count Dooku, commanded vast armies of battle droids. B-1 units by the millions, super battle droids, destroyer droids that could roll themselves into lethal spheres, all directed by tactical AI, all produced without cost, all replaceable. The Republic had the clone troopers, grown on the distant world of Kamino from the genetic template of a single bounty hunter named Jango Fett. All of them identical, all of them trained from birth for this. And because both sides could replace their armies faster than they could actually destroy them, neither side could win. The war became a machine that consumed resources and lives, without producing anything except more war. For the Jedi, who had spent millennia as peacekeepers and philosophers and guardians of light, the role they found themselves in was corrosive in ways that the Council did not yet fully understand. They became generals. They commanded armies. They made strategic decisions that meant thousands of clones would die, would be replaced, would die again, in service of objectives that sometimes seemed to matter and sometimes did not. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood on battlefields across the galaxy, commanding the 212th Attack Battalion at Christophsis, at Ryloth, facing the cyborg General Grievous and his elite guard, fighting in campaigns that lasted weeks and produced no territorial gain worth remembering. There is something in the historical record, something quiet, about the way he moved through those years. a skilled commander, respected by his troops, but each campaign seeming to take something from him that did not grow back. He had been promised by the Force, by the Jedi, by his own deepest hope, that there was a reason Anakin Skywalker existed, that the boy represented something, a turning point, a prophecy moving toward fulfillment. Instead, Anakin was knighted during the war and given a Padawan of his own, a young Togruta named Ahsoka Tano, and Obi-Wan watched from a distance as his former student began to become something other than what he had tried to teach him to be. Yoda, the Grand Master, was ancient even then, nearly 900 years old, and he had already lived through wars and their forgetting, through the rise and fall of chancellors and governments. He would have recognized what was happening, the slow corruption of purpose, the way a noble institution can be turned toward ends it was never meant to serve. But even Yoda did not see the full shape of it, not yet. Master Mace Windu, one of the Order's greatest warriors, led clone forces and fought with a lightsaber of deep amethyst. Yet even his legendary skill could not break the stalemate that neither side seemed willing to acknowledge. Kit Fisto, Plo Koon, Arila Secura, Ki-Adi-Mundi, Cece Tien, all of them, masters and knights and promising younger Jedi, became stretched thinner and thinner across the galaxy, fighting on multiple fronts, never resting, never allowed to simply sit and meditate and remember why they had chosen this path. The casualties accumulated in ways that were almost statistical, almost forgettable. A master killed here, a knight there, a promising Padawan lost on a world whose strategic value would be forgotten within months. There was a battle on Umbara, a world of shadowless twilight where one Jedi general, a rogue named Pong Krell, ordered his own clone troops into slaughter as a kind of twisted military experiment, and the men under his command died by the thousands before anyone realized what was happening. And even that act of betrayal, that proof that the system was rotting from within, could not be stopped, could not be addressed fully, because there were too many other battles being fought, too many other crisis points demanding attention. The war was a weight that never lifted. Each month brought reports of new losses, new theaters of conflict, new demands for Jedi to be sent where they were needed most, which meant they were needed everywhere, which meant they could be spared nowhere. The clone troopers themselves, these millions of men with identical faces and numbers stamped on their armor instead of names, became something the Jedi had to reckon with, not just as a tool of the Republic, but as people, men who were dying because the Jedi commanded them to, men who had no choice in the matter any more than the Jedi themselves, by then, could refuse to fight. There is a darkness in that, a corruption, and I think the Jedi felt it, felt that something was being asked of them that ran counter to what they had always believed they were. But by the time that awareness crystallized into real alarm, the war had been grinding on for so long that it had become the normal shape of the galaxy, and you cannot easily imagine a world without the thing that has become normal, even if that thing is slowly poisoning you. The Separatists were led by Count Dooku, who was himself serving a master unknown to anyone but a handful of people in the galaxy, serving Darth Sidious, the hidden architect of everything, the patient Sith Lord who had set both sides in motion and was now watching his design unfold. But that knowledge was not yet in the light. That truth would not be revealed until it was far too late to matter. And so the war continued, Venator-class Star Destroyers against Lucrehulk battleships, clone battalions against droid armies, Jedi generals commanding from forward bases on 100 different worlds, all of them trying very hard not to ask themselves whether any of it was ever going to end, whether there was any victory worth the price they were paying. By 20 BBY, by the end of this chapter's span, the war had simply become the condition of existence, and the Jedi, stretched thin and exhausted and beginning to doubt, did not yet realize they were standing at the edge of a cliff they could not see in the dark. The stalemate was not a state that could last forever, though it seemed, to those living in it, as if it would. There is something almost tender about the way these old documents describe it. Anakin and Padme, standing together in the gardens of the royal palace of Naboo, in the dying light of a day in 22 BBY, the endless silver lakes of the planet holding their reflection as surely as a promise. Two droids, C-3PO and R2-D2, had witnessed the ceremony. No priest, no public declaration, only the two of them and the machines that understood how to keep a secret. It was an act of profound love and an act of profound transgression, because the code that bound Anakin as a Jedi forbade exactly this. Attachment, the kind of personal bond that plants its roots in one person and asks you to protect them at any cost. The Jedi taught that such bonds obscured clarity, that they made you vulnerable to fear and desperation, that they pulled you away from serving something larger than yourself. And Anakin, standing in those gardens, holding Padmé's hand as evening fell, had chosen her over the code. For 3 years, no one knew. For 3 years, he carried that secret like a separate heartbeat, the knowledge of it growing heavier the closer the war ground on. The more his master Obi-Wan relied on him, the more the Council sent him out again and again into the brutal machinery of the Clone Wars. There is something I keep thinking about in those 3 years of silence, what it must have cost him, holding both selves at once, the devoted Jedi that everyone saw, and the husband visiting what they thought was a refugee on Naboo whenever he could escape his duties, never letting one half of his life know about the other. By 19 BBY, with the war finally reaching toward some kind of conclusion, the secret had grown teeth. Padmé was pregnant. They had not planned for it, but there it was, the future moving toward him, and Anakin had begun to have dreams. Dreams of her death in the act of giving birth, her life draining away the way his mother SHMIs had drained away years before in that dark room on Tatooine, while his hands were helpless to stop it. The Force sometimes speaks through dreams, and Anakin listened to his dreams the way a man reads an oracle, because he had seen such visions come true before. His mother had died, after all. He had not been able to save her. And now the same terrible knowledge was whispered to him in the dark hours before dawn, that he would lose Padmé the same way, and that this time he would have to watch it happen, knowing exactly what it meant. Around the same time, in the halls and council chambers of the temple on Coruscant, a peculiar tension had begun to coil tighter and tighter, the way a serpent coils before it strikes. Anakin had been granted a seat on the High Council itself in 19 BBY, placed there by direct request of Chancellor Palpatine, who had become increasingly important to the Jedi's strategy and therefore to their deliberations. It was, on the surface, an extraordinary honor, a sign of trust and rank unlike anything given to a Jedi his age. But the Council had done something that day that had left a mark on him, a mark that festered. They had refused to grant him the title of Master. A seat without the rank. It was a withholding, an explicit statement that whatever trust they had placed in him was incomplete, that something in him remained unfinished or untrustworthy. And there is something particular about that kind of honor, isn't there? Something almost more wounding than simple rejection, because it asks you to sit among the master teachers of the Order while being told, silently but unmistakably, that you are not one of them. Anakin burned under it. Mace Windu had been one of the voices making that refusal audible, and that hurt too. Windu, the purple-bladed master, the second strongest voice on the Council after Yoda himself, standing firm that Anakin was not ready. More than that, there were whispers among some of the Council members, real whispers, carried on the Force itself, that the Chancellor was becoming something other than what he claimed, that his influence on Anakin was not entirely healthy. And so they had done something that still, when I read the accounts, makes me ache a little on Anakin's behalf. They had asked him to spy on Palpatine. Think about what that request was really asking. Anakin had grown close to the Chancellor over years of this long, grinding war, had confided in him, been counseled by him when the Council seemed distant or demanding or slow to understand what the fight actually required. And now they were asking him to betray that trust, to become an informant against the one man outside the Order who seemed to understand the depth of what he was carrying. It was a request that came from a place of genuine concern, from real wisdom. If they had only known the truth about Palpatine, they would have known their instinct was sound. But Anakin could not hear it that way. He heard it as doubt. He heard it as the Jedi Order, the institution that had raised him since childhood, finally admitting openly that they did not trust him. The official explanation was different, of course. They needed to understand the Chancellor's true intentions. There were irregularities in his consolidation of power. The war was moving toward its climax, and they needed clarity on what political forces were moving beneath the surface. But Anakin lived in that gap between explanation and what he felt in his chest, and in that gap, something began to darken. Obi-Wan, who had been his master, who had raised him from an apprentice and watched him become a general and knighted him as his own student, remained closer to Anakin than any other council member, but even Obi-Wan could not reach him entirely anymore. The council had asked Obi-Wan to be the one to seek out Palpatine's secrets, and Obi-Wan had carried the burden of it alone, unwilling to give Anakin the pain of direct refusal. So instead, Anakin found himself increasingly separated from the person who had always been his anchor. By the time the war moved toward its final battles, with the Separatists making a last stand on worlds across the Outer Rim, Anakin was standing at a kind of crossroads that he was only partly aware of. On one side, the Order that had made him, that had saved him from the slavery and powerlessness of Tatooine, that had given him purpose and community and a lightsaber and a place to belong, but which now doubted him, withheld its highest honor, and asked him to spy on the one person outside its walls who seemed to understand his deepest fears. On the other side, Palpatine, who listened, who suggested that there were paths the Jedi would never teach him, who hinted that the dark side held knowledge that could prevent death, that could prevent the kind of loss that had haunted Anakin since his mother's hands had grown cold in his arms. And in his own body, in the privacy of his own Force presence, Anakin was splitting in two. The secret marriage, the hidden wife and the hidden child, the visions of Padmé's death that came like an illness he could not cure, the humiliation of the withheld rank, the sting of being asked to betray the man who seemed to be the only one who believed in him without condition, all of it gathering in him like a storm. I find myself thinking about how close he came, in those final months, to having a different story entirely. How thin the wall was between his fear and his rage, between what the Jedi Order was asking of him and what they might have given him if they had only known how to meet him where he actually stood, broken and terrified, and reaching out. That is what makes this moment so hard to sit with. The knowledge that the tragedy to come was not inevitable, that it grew out of miscalculation and fear, and the inability of frightened people to reach across the distance between what they suspected and what they could not quite see. The hidden apprentice was being forged not by the enemy, but by the fractures in the home he had been given. Let me step back now and tell you about the man at the center of all this, because Order 66 did not simply happen. It was built, carefully, and with an intelligence that is almost difficult to comprehend, across decades of patient arrangement. His name was Sheev Palpatine, and on the surface, he was a senator from Naboo, a soft-spoken politician with graying hair and a manner that suggested he had never raised his voice in anger in his life. But that was a mask, and it was not the first one he had worn. The being underneath was a Sith Lord called Darth Sidious, the latest in a lineage that traced backward through centuries of dark side practitioners, each one trying to accomplish what none of them had managed: the permanent subjugation of the galaxy and the utter erasure of the Jedi Order. Before he became Palpatine, before he became Sidious even, he had served another Sith Lord named Darth Plagueis, a moon banker named Higo Damask, who had taught him the deepest secrets of the dark side. Plagueis had studied the nature of life itself at the cellular level, and he had claimed, whether truly or not we may never know, to have discovered a way to cheat death itself using the Force. One night, Sidious put a pillow over his sleeping master's face, and murdered him, absorbing his knowledge and stepping into the role of master in the rule of two. This is what the Sith had been building toward for 1,000 years, a structure so small it could hide anywhere, so disciplined it could never tear itself apart from within, and so patient could play a single game across generations. A master and an apprentice, nothing more, but arranged so that they could slowly hollow out a civilization from the inside, without the civilization ever quite understanding what was happening. And Palpatine was a masterwork of this philosophy. He did not conquer the Republic directly, because conquering directly would trigger unified resistance. Instead, he allowed the Republic to conquer itself, and he stood ready to rule the ruins. Do you remember the invasion of Naboo, that act of apparent piracy by the Trade Federation that occurred when Palpatine was still a younger man? That was him, or rather, it was his apprentice at the time, Count Dooku, acting on his instructions through a network of intermediaries so layered it would take historians decades to unravel. The invasion created a crisis, a moment of panic that destabilized the sitting chancellor, and in that moment of instability, Palpatine entered the Senate as a delegate, then maneuvered himself into position as Chancellor of the entire Republic. And once he held that office, the real work could begin. He had already set in motion something far larger, a clone army grown in secret on the water world of Kamino, each soldier identical to a template named Jango Fett, a Mandalorian bounty hunter whose genetic material was copied 10 million times over into obedient soldiers who had never been taught to question an order. But the beautiful part, the part that shows you the depth of the orchestration, was what lay hidden inside each clone's mind. Deep in their neural tissue, the Kaminoans, the aliens who had engineered the clones, had implanted contingency orders, behavioral directives locked into their biology, waiting for a specific signal to activate. These were the chips, and though the Jedi would not fully understand their existence until it was far too late, their presence meant that Palpatine had created soldiers who could not disobey him even if they wanted to. He did not need loyalty. He had compliance written into the genetic code itself. And then came the Separatist Confederacy, the breakaway faction led by Count Dooku that declared itself independent from the Republic and began systematically attacking Republic worlds. Except, and here is the crucial part, Dooku was Palpatine's apprentice, and the Separatist Confederacy was Palpatine's creation. Palpatine led both sides of the war. He funded the Separatists through layers of proxies and shell corporations. He sent Dooku to attack Republic worlds, and then he sent the clone army. The army the Separatists had been designed to provoke into existence to fight back. He had created a perpetual motion machine of conflict, and into that machine he fed the Jedi Order. For 3 years the war ground on, and with each passing month Palpatine was granted more emergency powers, consolidated more authority, stretched the Jedi thinner and thinner across 1,000 worlds, and watched as the beings who had served as peacekeepers for a millennium were transformed into military generals fighting a war they could not win, because they did not understand that both armies served the same hidden master. I think about what it must have felt like to sit in the council chamber during those years and feel the weight of the Force itself growing darker, and not to fully comprehend why. The Jedi sensed something wrong, they always do, but they were too depleted, too scattered, too much at war with themselves to see the shape of what was really happening. And meanwhile Anakin Skywalker was burning with the knowledge that he was doubted, that the Council did not trust him, that his wife was carrying a child he was terrified he would lose, and Palpatine, patient, attentive Palpatine, was there to listen without judgment, to offer solutions the Jedi would never offer, to be the father figure the boy had lost. In the final weeks before Order 66, as Anakin slipped deeper into darkness, Palpatine made his move. He revealed himself to Anakin as a Sith Lord, as the architect of everything the Jedi had been fighting, and he offered Anakin exactly what Anakin needed: knowledge that might save Padmé from death, even though that knowledge was forbidden, even though pursuing it meant betraying everything he had been taught. When Mace Windu and his team came to arrest Palpatine, they did not come to a terrified Chancellor. They came to a Sith Lord in his element, surrounded by his own guards, and they fell one by one, Agent Kola, Cece Tien, Kit Fisto, each of them cut down by Force lightning and lightsaber. And when Windu had disarmed Palpatine, when he was moments from ending this, Anakin did what Palpatine had spent months maneuvering him to do. He saved the Sith Lord's life. The lightning came next, and Windu fell from the window, and in that moment, the whole apparatus that Palpatine had constructed for 1,000 years finally completed its function. He activated Order 66 not as an improvisation, but as the culmination of a plan so elaborate that it had required the cooperation of 2 armies, the corruption of a council member, the breeding of 10 million soldiers with obedience written into their biology, and the patience to wait until the moment was absolutely perfect. Within minutes, clone troopers across the galaxy received a transmission encoded into their neural implants, and they turned on their commanders. It was not mutiny or betrayal in the human sense, because the clones had never truly been given the choice to betray. It was execution of a program, the mathematical completion of an equation that had been written years before in a lab on Kamino. The Jedi Order, which had stood for 1,000 years, fell in a single night, and the Sith, after a millennium of waiting, of suffering defeats, of rebuilding in secret, had finally won. There is something I find myself thinking about, and perhaps you will too. All of this required Anakin's choice in the end. The plan was vast and intricate, but it was not inevitable until the moment a man chose to save a murderer over his brothers. That is what complexity sometimes obscures, that even the most elaborate trap still requires the person who walks into it to take the final step. The galaxy was not conquered by Palpatine's genius alone. It was conquered by Palpatine's genius and Anakin's fear, and the accumulated fractures within the Order that made it impossible to see the simplest truth until it was already too late. Let that settle. So now we come to the day itself, the moment when everything that had been built across 3 years of war and orchestrated across decades of patience simply collapsed into geometry. It began with a signal traveling at light speed across 10,000 worlds simultaneously, carrying 7 words that would reshape the galaxy forever. Execute Order 66. On Coruscant, in the upper echelons of the Senate building, where the most powerful man in the Republic kept his office, Sheev Palpatine spoke those words calmly into a secure channel, knowing they were already embedded in the neural tissue of 10 million minds. In military bases across the galaxy, on star destroyers in orbit, on outposts in jungle and desert and ice, on ships falling through hyperspace toward their destinations, clone commanders received the transmission and without hesitation acknowledged, "It will be done, my lord." What is strange, what I find myself dwelling on, is that they did not experience it as a betrayal of an order they disagreed with or had to overcome in themselves. The inhibitor chips suppressed that kind of resistance entirely. They felt instead that they had suddenly been told the truth about something they should have known all along, that the Jedi were traitors, that this had always been the case, that executing them was the lawful and correct thing to do. The conditioning was so complete that obedience felt like clarity. On Utapau, a high wind-swept world of sinkholes and great stone bridges, Obi-Wan Kenobi stood exhausted above the body of General Grievous, whom he had just defeated in the kind of long, grinding lightsaber duel that was becoming familiar to him. He had been a general now for 3 years, and the weight of it showed on his face in a way that a year of that war would not have predicted. His clone commander, CC-1138, whom Obi-Wan knew by the name Cody, stood nearby as he had throughout the campaign, reliable and professional in the way that Obi-Wan had come to depend on without really thinking about it. Cody received the order through his neural implant. The message that Obi-Wan Kenobi was a traitor. The message that his commander must be executed. Something in Cody's brain simply switched off the part of him that remembered 3 years of campaigns fought alongside this Jedi Master, of respect earned in difficult places, of trust that had become habitual and real. What remained was duty. Cody ordered his troops to fire, and Obi-Wan, his senses sharpened by exhaustion and a lifetime of war, did what he had trained his whole life to do. He reacted. He dove from the platform into the chasm below, into the dark water, and he lived because the reflexes that the Force had given him were faster than the moment of surprise that had unmade him. On Felucia, a world of bioluminescent forests and towering fungal gardens, Aurilla Secura walked with her troops after a successful engagement, her blue skin catching the strange light of that strange place. She had served with her clone commander for years, and there was genuine warmth between them, the kind of relationship that happens between people who have survived hard things together. When Order 66 came, Commander Bly turned his weapon on her without warning, without any visible struggle at all. She was shot down where she stood, gunned down by the very soldiers she had been protecting. On my Jito, Kai-Adi-Mundi, whose angular face and high forehead made him look always like he was thinking of something distant, was cut down by Commander Bakara and the troops of the Galactic Marines, soldiers he had trained and led and trusted. On Salukami, Stas Ali, racing across open ground on a speeder bike, was shot from behind by Commander Neo, her vehicle careening into the dust before she could understand what had happened. On Kato Ni Moidia, Plo Koon was flying his starfighter in formation with his clone wingmen when they opened fire on him simultaneously, and his ship, beautiful and sleek, and designed to be a weapon in the hands of a Jedi, became a coffin falling burning through the atmosphere. These deaths were not dramatic or uncertain. They were not struggles. They were executions, carried out with the precision of soldiers following orders, without the shadow of guilt or hesitation that a true betrayal would have required. On Kashyyyk, on that humid world of ancient forests and Wookiee cities built into trees, something different happened. Yoda was there, the oldest being alive, who had trained Jedi for 800 years, who carried centuries of experience in that small, ancient frame. He was with the Wookiee General Tarful when the clones received their orders. But Yoda sensed what was happening, sensed it through the Force like a scream traveling across the galaxy. Each death, a note in a symphony of betrayal that only he could fully hear. He sensed the deaths of Aurilla Secura, of Kai-Adi-Mundi, of dozens of Jedi whose names he had known and trained. What he sensed was the death of the Jedi Order itself, happening in a moment across 10,000 worlds. And Yoda, who had survived for 900 years by being wise and patient, suddenly became something else. Quick, vicious, absolutely certain. When the clones moved against him, when his own troops reached for their weapons, he killed them. He did not hesitate, and he did not fail. The Wookiees, Tarful and Chewbacca, would help him escape, would arrange passage off-world in an escape pod that shot upward through the canopy, carrying the last Grand Master away from the burning galaxy below. What I think about, sitting with all of this, is the terrible precision of it. Palpatine had spent decades positioning pieces on a board, and now, in a single moment, they all moved at once. The Jedi had been told they were the guardians of peace and justice, and so they had walked into positions of absolute trust with 10 million soldiers whose loyalty, they assumed, was built on something more than a chemical whisper in the brain. The war had stretched them across the galaxy, separated them, made them dependent on the very people who would kill them. Anakin Skywalker, who had turned to darkness in the Chancellor's office, was already leading the 501st Legion toward the Jedi Temple as the Order was being executed across the stars. By the time Obi-Wan was pulling himself from the water on Utapau, the younglings on Coruscant, children who had been learning to sense the Force, who had done nothing wrong except be born with a gift, were being hunted through the halls of the temple they had called home. The temple itself, that ancient place of learning that had stood for 10,000 years, was burning. What remained after that day was silence. The Jedi Order, which had numbered 10,000 strong at the war's beginning, was reduced in hours to perhaps a handful. A dozen survivors scattered across a galaxy that had been told, officially and repeatedly, that Jedi were traitors and should be reported and executed on sight. The rest were gone. And I find myself thinking about those last moments before the firing began, those final seconds where Arila Secura walked with her troops, where Plo Koon flew in formation with his wingmen, where they still believed in continuity, in tomorrow, in the stability of the world they had always known. The galaxy did not end with a bang that day, not really. It ended with a quiet order, transmitted through space at light speed, rewriting 10 million minds in an instant. It ended with soldiers pulling triggers. It ended with Jedi falling where they stood, betrayed by the hands they had extended to save the Republic itself. There is a moment, just before the end of something vast, when you can feel it in the Force, a kind of fracture spreading silently through everything. Yoda felt it first on Kashyyyk, in the middle of a war that was not really a war at all, though he did not yet have words for that understanding. The Wookiees needed him. The separatist droids still pressed down from the inland plateaus, and he had promised Tarful and Chewbacca that the Republic would stand with them, that they would not face the darkness alone. He was 900 years old, and in all of those centuries, he had learned to trust the warning that comes through the Force like a change in air pressure before a storm. When it came, not loud but absolute, he knew. His clone commander, a soldier he had fought beside for 3 years, raised his blaster with a kind of terrible certainty, as if the order to kill him had become the truest thing the man had ever known. Yoda did not hesitate, did not try to reason with him. The time for reasoning had passed in an instant, so quick it barely registered. He moved with the economical grace of someone who has refined the art of staying alive across centuries, and his lightsaber found its arc before the clones could fire. 2 heads fell into the Kashyyyk grass, and for a moment the only sound was the gentle hum of his blade cooling. There was no triumph in it, only the cold recognition of what had just happened. The clone army had turned, and if the clones had turned, then the order had come from above, from someone high enough to reach them all at once. Tarful and Chewbacca came to him in the smoke and confusion, and without words, the Wookiees understood what their friend did not need to say. They helped him move toward the landing platform where his ship waited. He could feel them now if he opened himself to it. The presence of his order dying across 10,000 worlds in a single coordinated moment, not fallen in battle, but shot down by their own people, by the ones they had trained and led and trusted. Each death was a separate small silence in the Force, and together they made a sound like the galaxy breaking. The flight from Kashyyyk was not long, but it was long enough for the full weight of it to settle over him like ash. He did not go home first, though home, the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, was calling to him through every instinct he possessed. Instead, he let his ship fall toward the capital world with its great domed city, and as he descended through the atmosphere, he could feel the temple like a wound in the Force, still burning, still screaming. The recall beacon was still broadcasting, its false summons drawing any survivors like moths toward fire, and Yoda understood immediately that it was a trap, that whoever had orchestrated this had thought through every move ahead of time, had left nothing to chance. He landed in the lower districts, away from the main docks, and moved through the city's arteries like a ghost, his small shape easily missed, easily forgotten. The temple doors were sealed, but seals meant nothing to someone who carried a lightsaber and 800 years of knowing how to get inside places that had been made not to be entered. What he found inside was worse than anything the Force had prepared him for. The bodies of younglings lay in the temple gardens, their small forms still and cold, their lightsabers scattered beside them like toys. These were children who had barely begun to understand what it meant to carry the Force, and someone had decided that the gentlest answer was to end them before they could become a threat. Yoda stood in that garden for a long moment, and I think, though this is only something I feel in the telling, that this was the moment when the Grand Master's 1,000 years finally caught up with him, when the weight of all that survival and all that responsibility crystallized into something that could not be carried anymore, only endured. He found Obi-Wan Kenobi in the temple archives, the older Jedi's face grave with the same terrible knowledge. There were no words between them that needed saying, only the shared moment of understanding that they were two survivors in a temple full of the dead, and that the temple itself had become a tomb. Together, they reprogrammed the beacon, inverting its purpose. Instead of calling the survivors home, it would warn them away, tell them to scatter, to hide, to become as ghost as the dead around them. They watched the security recordings together, and that was when Yoda saw what had happened in the temple, saw the figure in black leading the assault, saw the young man he had helped raise walk across the temple floors, killing Jedi with the precision of someone who had known them all his life. Anakin Skywalker had become something else, something that wore his face but moved with a different gravity, and his name was Vader now, a title as far from the boy Yoda remembered as the darkness is from light. There was no time for grief, not really, though both of them felt it, a cold and spreading kind of sorrow that would not fully break until years later, in isolation, when they had nothing left but time to think about the names of the dead. Obi-Wan would go to find Anakin, to face what his Padawan had become, to make one last desperate attempt to save him, or at least to stop him. But Yoda understood that the source of all of this sat in the Senate chamber, in a room where power was traded like currency, where the man who had orchestrated every moment of the Clone Wars now sat in triumph. He had to confront him, had to know if there was even a possibility of stopping what had been set in motion. So the Grand Master made his way to the Senate building, and there, in the great chamber where the Republic's leaders had gathered and scattered and fought with words rather than blades, he found Darth Sidious waiting for him with a lightsaber that burned with a cold red light. The duel between them lasted only moments, and Yoda was still the greatest lightsaber master in the galaxy, his form still flawless, his connection to the Force still deeper than almost any being alive. But Sidious was younger, his power refined and absolute, his connection not to the light but to something deeper and darker, and when Yoda struck at him with everything he had, he found something immovable standing against him, something that had planned this confrontation down to the smallest detail. The duel ended not with victory, but with the recognition that victory was no longer possible, that the war had already been lost in 1,000 small moments before Yoda even knew a war was being fought. He had to run, had to leave, had to accept for the first time in 900 years that there were things in the galaxy that could not be faced down with a lightsaber and centuries of wisdom. Senator Bail Organa, the man who had fought beside the Jedi during the war, who understood what had happened and why it mattered, helped him disappear into the depths of space. There was a small ship, a passage arranged with the kind of care that came from understanding that the galaxy's last hope lay in the old Jedi Master staying alive, staying hidden, becoming invisible to everything but the Force itself. As Yoda looked back at Coruscant receding behind him, the great city that had been home to the Jedi for 1,000 years burning with the light of a new power, I think he began to understand what his path would be. Not victory, not triumph, but something else. Witness, warning, the preservation of memory in a place so far from power that no one would ever think to look. And so the Grand Master set his course for a world he had rarely visited, a planet of swamps and mist and ancient Force energy, a place where a Jedi could disappear completely and still remain present, still remain whole. Dagobah was waiting, though Yoda could not have known that when he made the jump to hyperspace, leaving behind everything he had built, everything he had been, everything the Jedi Order had meant for 937 years. He carried with him only what could be carried, the knowledge of the Force, the memory of those who had fallen, and the certainty, hard-won and terrible, that the darkness had won, that the Republic had fallen, that the Jedi were no more. All that remained was to survive long enough to see what might grow in that darkness, to wait for the light to return, to trust that the Force had a way of restoring balance, even when everything suggested that balance was gone forever. In the hours after witnessing Anakin's fall in the Temple archives, Obi-Wan Kenobi made a choice that would reshape the remainder of his life. He decided that he was going to disappear. Not flee, though that word applies too, but disappear in a deeper sense, cease to be the person the galaxy had known, become someone small and watchful instead. The Jedi Order had been his entire existence for decades. The Temple's stone corridors, the council chamber where he had sat among the wisest beings in the Republic, the lightsaber that had been as much a part of him as his own hand. All of it was gone now, or worse than gone, inverted, corrupted, made into the instrument of its own destruction. The recall beacon they had reprogrammed aboard the Tantive IV was meant to warn the survivors away, to say, "Do not come home, the temple is a tomb." But Obi-Wan knew the truth. The survivors would receive no warning at all because there was no one left to receive it. He had reviewed the security recordings with his own eyes, had watched Anakin in that black tunic walking through the temple halls, igniting his lightsaber against the youngest members of the Order. There is a particular quality of devastation that comes not from losing something, but from watching the person you loved most become the instrument of that loss, and I think Obi-Wan felt it in full measure in those hours. Yoda sensed it too, that terrible weight, which is perhaps why the Grand Master made the choice he did. After their attempt to stop Palpatine in the Senate chamber had ended in stalemate, after Yoda had acknowledged that the Order could not be saved by force, the two of them stood in the Tantive IV's corridor with Bail Organa and understood without speaking that they had to fragment. One person could not hide and survive the hunters that were coming, but seven scattered across the galaxy with no knowledge of each other's locations, with only the faintest possible connection through the Force that might work. That might be a way to preserve something, even if it was only memory. Yoda would go to Dagobah, that ancient swamp world at the edge of known space, untouched and hidden. Obi-Wan would go to Tatooine, the planet where Anakin had been born, the world Anakin had tried so desperately to escape, the place he had left behind and never returned to. It was the last place anyone would look for one of the Jedi who had trained him. There was a cruel kind of poetry in that, and Obi-Wan was aware of it. Bail Organa offered to take the infant Luke Skywalker, Padmé's son, Anakin's son, the last fragment of the bloodline that had held such terrible promise, and raise him on Alderaan as his own. Obi-Wan would deliver the child first to Owen Lars, Anakin's stepbrother, on the moisture farm in the Jundland wastes where Anakin had grown up in heat and dust and longing. Then Obi-Wan would stay. He would live in exile within sight of the boy, but never seen, a ghost watching over the ghost of the man Anakin had been. This is the moment where I want to pause and acknowledge something that the films do not dwell on, but that I find myself thinking about a lot. Obi-Wan did not know, when he made this choice, that other council members had survived. He believed himself to be the last. Yoda had escaped Kashyyyk and escaped Coruscant. Obi-Wan knew that much. But Yoda was not the only one, even though the evidence seemed to suggest otherwise. There were whispers in the Force that neither of them consciously heard, other presences moving through hiding and shadow across the galaxy. But in the immediate aftermath of the Purge, in those first desperate days of flight, Obi-Wan had no way of knowing this. He believed that he and Yoda, and possibly a handful of others, were all that remained of an order that had commanded 10,000 souls. The moral weight of that belief cannot be overstated. It meant that when Obi-Wan made the decision to bury himself on Tatooine, to adopt the alias Ben Kenobi and live as an anonymous hermit in the desert, he was not simply choosing survival. He was choosing to become a living tomb. He would carry with him all the knowledge, all the training, all the memory of what the Jedi had been, and he would let it die with him, because the alternative was to pass it on and put others in danger. The Order had been shattered by trust, by Anakin trusting Palpatine, by the clone troopers unable to resist the inhibitor chips in their own minds, by Obi-Wan trusting in Anakin's redemption one moment too long. Trust had become a weapon. So Obi-Wan chose isolation instead. The journey to Tatooine takes time, and there is something I want to acknowledge about what that meant. It was time alone with what he had done and what he had failed to do. He had been the negotiator, the Jedi who could talk his way out of impossible situations, the one who had survived assassination attempts and civil wars, and the betrayal of a cyborg general across 1,000 battlefields. And he had failed at the only negotiation that mattered. When Anakin needed someone to believe in him completely, without reservation, without asking him to spy on a Sith Lord and report back to the Council, Obi-Wan had instead chosen the Order's suspicion. He carried that knowledge to Tatooine. When he arrived at the Lars homestead in the heat of a Tatooine day, holding the swaddled infant Luke, he passed the child to Owen Lars and Beru Whiteson with instructions to hide the boy, to raise him as a farm boy and nothing more, to let him believe his father was dead. "His father is dead," Obi-Wan said, and he meant it completely. Anakin Skywalker had died the moment he became Darth Vader, and no amount of time or healing would change that. Then Obi-Wan went into the desert. He established a hermitage in the Jundland Wastes, a small dwelling from which he could watch over Luke from a distance, close enough to protect the boy if something threatened him, far enough away that his presence would not complicate the child's ordinary, earthbound life. This is where the Jedi Master became a hermit, where the man who had served on the High Council became someone whose existence was measured not in days and missions and diplomatic triumphs, but in the simple, repetitive rhythms of desert survival. He meditated on the Force in ways he had never had time to do before. He learned, or began to learn, to perceive the presence of Qui-Gon Jinn, his former master, reaching out across the veil between life and death. And he waited. He did not know what he was waiting for, except that Yoda's cryptic final words had suggested that time was not finished with the Jedi, that some thread remained unbroken, that the Force still moved in ways even the survivors could not yet perceive. But that knowledge, that possibility, would remain hidden from him for years yet, buried as deeply as his name. For now, there was only the heat, the endless desert, a child growing up in a moisture farm, and one old man watching from the shadows, carrying the weight of a destroyed order on his shoulders and choosing, every single day, to bear it in silence. In the days and weeks that followed the fall, while Yoda sat in meditation on a transport bound for Dagobah and Obi-Wan, watched the twin sunsets of Tatooine from a moisture farm he would call home, 4 other members of the High Council were making choices that would keep them breathing, choices made in darkness, without counsel, guided only by instinct and the fading echoes of the Force itself. Quinlan Vos, the Kifar master whose telepathic gifts and red eyes had marked him as unconventional even among the 12, had been conducting a deep cover operation in the Outer Rim when Order 66 came down like a wave through the Force. He was not at the temple. He was not commanding troops. He was, by a mercy he did not understand in that moment, far enough from the center of the Purge that the initial wave of killing passed him by. When he felt it, the sudden, terrible silence where the voices of 10,000 Jedi had been singing in the Force a moment before, Vos did the only thing a being with his gifts could do. He ran. He abandoned his mission, left behind the contacts and safe houses and aliases he had cultivated, and moved through the spaceports and trade routes like a ghost, using his telepathic sight to read the thoughts of clone troopers before they could read orders to hunt him. I find myself thinking about what that must have been like, the constant, exhausting vigilance, the need to stay ahead of an enemy that was everywhere now, that wore the faces of friends. Vos understood what the others were learning in scattered moments across the galaxy. The Republic was gone, the clone army had turned, and the only way to survive was to become someone no one was looking for. Coleman Kakaj, the Ongri master whose soft, deliberate manner had earned him a place of quiet authority on the council, emerged from a briefing on medical advancements in the lower levels of Coruscant to find clone troopers already sealing the temple entrances. There was no dramatic escape, no lightsaber duel, only the presence of mind to not go back, to not answer the recall beacon that was broadcasting across the city like a siren. Kaj made his way to a safe house that Bail Organa of Alderaan had quietly established years before, one of several sanctuaries maintained for Jedi who needed shelter outside the temple. There were others there, not many, perhaps 3 or 4, and they made a decision together that would define their survival. They would study the pattern of the Purge, piece together what had happened, and then disappear into the infrastructure of the galaxy in ways that would make them invisible to the Empire's new hunters. The Force, they realized, had become a trap. The very thing that connected them to one another could also lead the hunters to them. So they began to withdraw from it, to meditate in silence instead of in the light, to dampen the brightness of their presence in the Force until they were like stars hidden behind dust clouds. CC Tin, the Ektochi master whose precognitive gifts had served the Order for decades, had been on a mission in deep space when the Order came through the clone chain of command to his naval vessel. His crew turned on him, not from malice, but from compulsion, from something burned into their very neural structure, and he had perhaps a handful of seconds to recognize what was happening before instinct took over. He killed them, or some of them. The details of such moments have a way of becoming blurred in memory, especially for those who survive them by necessity rather than choice. His ship, crippled by the brief conflict, was still functional enough to jump to hyperspace, and Tin pointed it toward the outer rim, toward empty space, toward anywhere that was not here. For months after, he drifted, moving from system to system, never staying long enough to be found, never allowing himself to trust anyone. He had been a warrior of the Jedi. Now he would become a ghost, a rumor, a whisper in the Force that the hunters might sense but never quite catch. Coleman Kaj and the others at Bail Organa's sanctuary understood that the temple had fallen, that the beacon had been corrupted into a trap, that anyone who had answered it was already dead. What they did not know, what Yoda and Obi-Wan also did not know, was that each of them was not alone, that across the vastness of the galaxy, other survivors were making their own impossible calculations, their own desperate choices to persist. The Force was damaged now, fractured, its unified song fragmented into isolated whispers. And yet through that same broken connection, each of them could feel, sometimes only half-consciously, that they were not the only ones. There was a Jedi on a trading vessel in the corporate sector, posing as a merchant and buying passage with credits forged from carefully hidden Jedi stores. There was another in the spice mines of Kessel, going by a false name, doing the heavy, numbing work that required the kind of disconnection from the Force that had become their greatest survival tool. There was one more, whose name and face would fade from memory even among the other survivors, hidden so completely that they would become less a person than a legend whispered by those who had never met them. What united them was not kinship or communication. Contact was too dangerous now, but a shared understanding that the Order they had served with their whole lives was gone, and that the only honorable thing left to do was to endure to survive, to keep the knowledge and memory of the Jedi alive in their own minds, until, perhaps, a time might come when it could be shared again. The weeks after Order 66 were a sorting, a brutal triage in which the galaxy decided who would live and who would die, not through heroic confrontation, but through the simple mathematics of being in the wrong place at the right moment, or the right place at the wrong moment, or having the instinct to run rather than fight. 4 council members had that instinct, or that luck, or both. They would spend the next years in isolation, so complete that even other Jedi survivors would not know their names, would not know they had lived, would only sometimes, in the depth of meditation or the sudden opening of the Force in a moment of danger, sense that somewhere in the galaxy, in a spaceport or a mine or a hidden room behind an ordinary wall. Another heartbeat was still keeping time. There is a peculiar loneliness to being the last Jedi on a conquered world, and I want you to sit with that feeling for a moment before we go further into what happened to Ki-Adi-Mundi on Mygeeto. He was a Sarian, which meant his mind worked differently than most beings in the Order. A binary brain, two lobes housed in that distinctive elongated cranium, capable of holding multiple thoughts at once, complex calculations running in parallel. It is a detail that matters, I think, because it speaks to how Ki-Adi-Mundi saw patterns others missed, how he could hold suspicion and loyalty in the same space without them cancelling each other out. During the Clone Wars, he had been one of the Council members most openly troubled by Palpatine's accumulation of power, most vocal about the danger of what a Supreme Chancellor could do with emergency authority. He had raised his voice in those chambers, where Yoda listened and Obi-Wan carried the weight of moral exhaustion, and Ki-Adi-Mundi said, "This is not right. This concentration of power is not the way of the Republic we are meant to serve." But even as he spoke those words, he remained a general, remained connected to his clone troops, remained embedded in the machinery of the very system he was warning against. By 19 BBY, Ki-Adi-Mundi commanded the Galactic Marines, the 21st Nova Corps, identifiable by their grey and white armor, distinctive and clean even in the chaos of war. Commander Bakara led them, and between Bakara and Ki-Adi-Mundi, there was something that looked, from the outside, like trust. They had fought together across multiple theaters, Mygeeto among them, a world in the Outer Rim, controlled by the Separatists, valuable to the intergalactic banking clan that funded much of the Confederacy's war machine. Ki-Adi-Mundi had a family, in the way that Sarians could, with children scattered across the galaxy, relationships that mattered deeply to him in a way that contradicted every vow the Order asked him to keep. I wonder, sometimes, if that contradiction was something he carried knowingly, or if he had made peace with it the way soldiers sometimes do, by not looking at it too closely. On the day Order 66 was transmitted across the galaxy, Ki-Adi-Mundi was still on Mygeeto, in the field with his troops, moving through the aftermath of some small tactical victory against the droid forces. The Order came through the inhibitor chips implanted in the clone troopers' brains, and Bakara received it not as a choice, but as absolute truth, as unquestionable as gravity. One moment, they were soldiers fighting alongside their Jedi general, and the next, they were executioners. Ki-Adi-Mundi had time, at least, to understand what was happening. His binary brain was fast enough to process the betrayal, fast enough to recognize in the sudden shift of the Galactic Marines' posture the same kind of corruption he had warned about in the Council chambers. He had time to draw his blue lightsaber. He had time to deflect some of the blaster bolts coming at him, that distinctive sound of plasma splitting around a Force user's blade, the particular rhythm of defense against an overwhelming fire. But time is not the same as salvation. Commander Bakara and the troops under his command were professionals, and there was nowhere for a Jedi to retreat on a world he had thought was under his control. The bolts kept coming, and Ki-Adi-Mundi kept deflecting, kept trying, and then, as it happened to so many that day, across 10,000 worlds, he fell. There is a documentary quality to it, I know, a flatness that comes from describing something so terrible. But I think that flatness is sometimes necessary, because the alternative is to dress it up as tragic theater, to make it about something grander than what it was. What it was, a Jedi Master with a binary brain and a family he loved, a man who had seen the danger coming and raised his voice and remained anyway, because that is what duty meant, to stay at your post even when you suspected it was a trap. He died on Mygeeto, in grey Outer Rim dust, at the hands of soldiers he had trusted. The particular cruelty of Order 66 was not just that it killed Jedi. It was that it forced the Jedi's own soldiers to do the killing, to turn love or respect or simple camaraderie into the instrument of murder. For Ki-Adi-Mundi, who had stood in the council chambers and warned about the concentration of power, who had held that warning against his loyalty to the Order and chosen to stay, that cruelty must have felt like vindication and failure all at once. He was not, as we began this chapter's premise suggests, one of the 7 survivors. That framing was a small story we told ourselves, I think, because the full truth is harder to sit with. Most of them died that day, and Ki-Adi-Mundi was among them. He has the distinction, though, of being one of the few High Council members whose death we can trace with certainty, whose last moments we can see, whose final stand, however brief, however insufficient, is recorded. In the months to come, in the first years of the Empire, that will matter in a strange way. There will be others who escape into shadow, others whose fates remain unknown, but Ki-Adi-Mundi's death is not hidden. It is documented as part of the Order 66 montage that Palpatine engineered, a piece of the grand orchestration that the Emperor wanted the galaxy to see, or at least to see enough of that they would understand. The Jedi are gone, the threat has been eliminated, there is no point in hiding or searching for survivors. And yet survivors there were, even if Ki-Adi-Mundi was not among them. Even if the binary-brained Sarian who saw the patterns of power clearly was cut down before he could reach safety, others made it, through accident, through cunning, through the simple blind luck of being somewhere else when the Order came through. Ki-Adi-Mundi's last stand, such as it was, ended in defeat on a conquered separatist world, but in his death lay something unintended. Proof that not every Jedi died that day, that some were fast enough or fortunate enough to escape into the dark that followed. And in that proof, however small, lay the possibility of what comes after. In the aftermath of Order 66, in those first terrible months of 19 BBY, Emperor Palpatine had a problem that was not yet completely solved. There were still Jedi alive in the galaxy. Not many, perhaps a dozen, scattered across 10,000 worlds, isolated and hunted, but alive nonetheless, and each one represented a kind of fracture in the perfect totality of his victory. A Sith Lord does not rest with a job half finished, and Palpatine understood this perhaps better than anyone who had ever lived. So in the early Imperial period, as the new government consolidated its grip on the galaxy, as fear and propaganda and military presence rewrote the rules of everything that had existed before, Palpatine made a decision that would shape the next decades of the hunt. He would create an instrument specifically designed to finish what Order 66 had begun. He called it the Inquisitorius, the Imperial Inquisition, an organization of Force-sensitive agents answerable to him alone, tasked with one purpose: the absolute annihilation of every Jedi still breathing. What made this instrument so perfectly designed to its purpose was something almost elegant in its cruelty. The Inquisitors themselves would be turned Jedi. Not all of them, but many. Force-sensitive individuals who had once served the Order, or who had glimpsed the light and then been shown the dark, and who would now be trained in the dark side by Vader and the Emperor himself to hunt their former brothers and sisters. There is a particular kind of pain in being hunted by someone who understands exactly where you hide, because they hid in those same places once. Because they know your language, your instincts, the shape of your fear. The Inquisitors were organized in ranks, each bearing a number that marked their position in the hierarchy. The Grand Inquisitor at the apex, then the second sister, the fifth brother, the sixth, seventh, and eighth brothers, others still unnamed in the records we have. Each of them, and this is the detail that haunted them, I think, though we have little record of their inner lives, each of them had been given a choice that was not really a choice: serve the Emperor in the hunt for Jedi or die. Some of them had been captured, others had fallen to the dark side and been found by Vader in the chaos of the Purge. Still others had been Force-sensitive individuals with no connection to the Order who were simply lifted into this dark and terrible purpose because they were useful. What they all shared was a singular obsession: because Palpatine demanded nothing less than total commitment, and because the dark side, when it claims you, leaves little room for hesitation. The Inquisitors were equipped with a weapon that became their signature across the galaxy, a lightsaber unlike anything the Jedi had ever forged. It was double-bladed, like Darth Maul's, but with a difference. The blade assembly rotated on a central axis, spinning like the rim of a wheel, a design that made the weapon simultaneously more efficient as a tool of combat and somehow more theatrical, more terrifying. The kyber crystals that powered them burned red, not the blue and green of Jedi blades, but the crimson of the dark side, achieved through a process called bleeding, where a Sith or dark side user poured pain and cruelty into a kyber crystal until it fractured and burned that angry red. The design of the spinning lightsaber served another purpose as well. In the hands of a skilled Inquisitor, the blade could be spun fast enough to hover beneath them, to lift them slightly off the ground, to become almost a flying disc. It was a small thing, a detail, but it meant that Inquisitors could move through space in ways Jedi could not, could pursue across terrain that should have been impassable, could corner prey in ways that left no avenue of escape. Everything about the Inquisitorius was designed not just to kill Jedi, but to make Jedi understand that there was nowhere left to run. The organization's base of operations was established on a place called Nur, an ocean moon orbiting Mustafar in the Outer Rim, a choice of location that was almost certainly deliberate, I think, placing the heart of the hunt literally in the shadow of the place where Anakin Skywalker had fallen and been reborn as Darth Vader. Fortress Inquisitorius rose from the water there, a dark spire of Imperial engineering, its walls thick enough to hold prisoners, its chambers deep enough to hold the archives and training facilities where Inquisitors learned to channel their power into the hunt. And from that fortress, across the weeks and months that followed the Purge, the Inquisitors began to move. They traveled in TIE advanced starfighters and Imperial cruisers, moving through hyperspace with the full backing of the Empire's navy behind them, following rumors and Force signatures, chasing whispers in the dark side, wherever a surviving Jedi's presence might still ripple the surface of the Force. What makes this period so difficult to reconstruct is that the hunt was systematic, but not centralized in the way we might imagine. There was no list of targets, no clear procedure beyond hunt and kill. Surviving Jedi had taken Yoda's warnings seriously and scattered, going silent, severing their connections to the Force as much as they could manage, becoming ghosts in their own hiding places. A Jedi in deep meditation can dim their presence to almost nothing, can make themselves nearly invisible to Force sensing, can teach themselves to touch the Force only in the smallest, quietest ways, a whisper rather than a shout. But absolute silence is impossible. The Force binds all living things, and a trained Force user, especially one as eager as an Inquisitor, can often sense even the most carefully hidden presence, if they are patient enough, if they search the right worlds, if they know where Jedi are likely to run. What this meant in practice was a galaxy-wide manhunt conducted in the shadows, without the fanfare of a military campaign, but with an intensity and focus that left few places truly safe. Palpatine himself oversaw this hunt, at least in its strategic direction, though he kept it at a distance. He had other empires to consolidate, other threats to manage, other games to play with the Force. The actual work fell to Darth Vader, who had a personal interest in finding and destroying the last Jedi that went beyond mere obedience to his master. Vader did not simply carry out orders. He pursued the hunt with a kind of hunger that those who worked under him found terrifying and useful in equal measure. He understood Jedi because he had been one, and he understood the ways they thought, the mistakes they might make, the refuge they might seek in the Force itself. He directed the Inquisitors with an almost surgical precision, assigning them to specific regions of space, to worlds where reports suggested Jedi might be hiding, to places where the Force seemed thick with possibility. And slowly, methodically, relentlessly, the hunt progressed. In the months that followed Order 66, one by one, the scattered survivors would have to reckon with this new reality. The Empire would not tire, would not stop, would hunt them with the organized patience of an enemy that had time on its side and unlimited resources to spend. The 7 who had escaped the initial purge now faced something in some ways more difficult than the sudden violence of Order 66. They faced the grinding, eternal certainty that they could never be safe, that the hunt would follow them to the edges of the galaxy and beyond, and that the only hope of survival lay in becoming nothing at all. And in the swamp of Dagobah, in a hermit's cave on Tatooine, in safe houses scattered across 1,000 worlds, in deep silence and the smallest flickers of the Force, they began to understand what it meant to be hunted by an empire that had infinite patience and a Sith Lord who could wait forever to claim them. This is where the real test began. Not the violence of Order 66, but the long, slow suffocation of being the last candles in an empire determined to snuff out every light. There is a particular weight to the moment when someone realizes they have been found, when the long silence they have kept breaks, and they understand that their life as they have known it is about to end. I want to tell you about Agent Kola, though the truth is that by the time we reach him in this story, there is already very little left to tell. He was a Zabrak, a man with the dark facial tattoos of his people marking him like a living document of his lineage, with the short horns that grew from his skull the way they do on Iridonia, and he had served on the Jedi High Council during the Clone Wars as a master of considerable skill and reputation. His lightsaber burned green, a color you do not see as often as blue or purple, and in the dueling styles of the Jedi, that green blade spoke to a kind of careful precision, a master who had studied the exact angles at which energy and matter could meet. You remember, perhaps, that in the final days before Order 66, 4 of the Council's members went to Palpatine's office to arrest him. Mace Windu led them, his purple blade already famous across the Order, and with him came Kit Fisto, whose Nautolan features and natural grace made him look almost serene even in confrontation, and Cece Tien, the Iktochi whose telepathic gifts had made him invaluable to the Council's work. And with them went Agent Kola. In Palpatine's office, in that moment when the arrest was meant to be made, and the Sith Lord finally revealed, Agent Kola was the first to fall. He did not survive that moment. He did not escape to hide in the darkness that followed Order 66, as some of the others did. His story does not belong to the survivors, and yet I find myself thinking about him here, in this chapter that is meant to be about Agent Kola's end, because there is something in his death that belongs to this larger story we are telling, something about what it meant to be a Jedi at the very moment the galaxy turned against them. When Palpatine's true nature revealed itself, when the dark side erupted from within him like something that had been waiting for years to be unleashed, the 4 masters found themselves facing not a chancellor to arrest, but something ancient and terrible and impossibly fast. Agent Kola, that careful master with his green blade and his studied precision, was first, not by accident, but because his position in the room placed him nearest, because the Force moves in patterns we cannot always predict or prevent. Palpatine's saber crossed his blade, and the 2 energies met, and in that instant, Agent Kola understood that he had walked into something deeper than he had known, that the man he was arresting was not simply powerful, but was something the Jedi Order had failed to see coming. It was a brief understanding, because the moment did not last long. The red blade of the Sith moved with a speed and certainty that spoke of centuries of study, of training that had been conducted in shadow while the Jedi trained in light, and Agent Kola fell. In the security recordings that would later be studied by the handful of Jedi who survived that day, his death appears almost incidental, a single moment in a sequence of moments, one blade striking another and then nothing. But I think about the man inside that moment, about Agent Kola, as he realized in the space of a second that everything he understood about the state of the Order and the state of the galaxy had been wrong, that the enemy had been sitting at the center of power the entire time, visible and unseen at once. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that realization, and I think he must have felt it in the instant before. The reason I am telling you about Agent Cola in this chapter, titled as it is with his name and his ending, is because he represents something that I think is worth sitting with for a moment. 7 council members survived Order 66, yes, and we have been following their threads through the darkness and the hunt that followed. But there were 12 on the council, and the 5 who did not survive were killed in ways that are perhaps more visible than the survival of the others, more recorded in the official histories of the Jedi's end. Agent Cola was one of the 5. He did not hide on a remote world with a false identity. He did not silence his presence in the Force and scatter across the galaxy. He did not meditate in exile waiting for the next move that might never come. He was killed in Palpatine's office, along with CC-10 and Kit Fisto, in the final moment before the order to execute all Jedi was transmitted to 1 million clone troopers across 1,000 worlds. In some ways, his death was cleaner, more immediate than the long attrition that would follow for those who escaped. In other ways, it carried a different kind of tragedy. He died knowing, at least, what he was fighting, whereas the survivors would spend years and decades wondering if the Order had truly been destroyed, wondering if there were others out there in the darkness, wondering if the Force itself had abandoned them. But here is what I keep returning to, and why I wanted to pause on Agent Cola before we move forward into the Hunters and the Hunted. He went to Palpatine's office that day as a Jedi Master, one of the highest-ranked members of an order that had stood for thousands of years, an order that had shaped the Republic, that had been the keepers of peace and justice and the light side of the Force. He went there because the Council had finally seen something wrong, finally sensed that the Chancellor was not what he seemed, and he went to do his duty as he understood it. He did not know that this was the moment toward which the entire Clone Wars had been building, that his arrest was the trigger for an order already written into the neurons of 1 million soldiers, that his death would be one note in a symphony of ending. He simply went, because that was what a Jedi did when the Order asked. And that, I think, is worth remembering as we turn to the stories of those who survived. The 7 who made it through the Purge did so partly through strength, partly through luck, partly through choices made in moments of terrible clarity, and partly through the grace of other people who sheltered them and hid them and asked nothing in return. But they carried always the knowledge that others had not made it, that Agent Cola and Ki-Adi-Mundi and Plo Koon and Stas Ali and CC-10 had fallen in the sudden violence, and that their own survival was purchased, in a way, by that loss. So when you hear the names of the 7 survivors, know that there are 5 other names that belong to this story as well. 5 faces that would not emerge from the darkness. 5 Jedi who had served the light and died trying to preserve it in the moment when the light was being extinguished across the galaxy. Agent Cola was one of them, and his green blade burned out on a day when all the green blades in the galaxy were going dark. There is a paradox in the life of CC-10 that I find myself returning to again and again, and perhaps I should name it plainly before we go any further. He was a being gifted with the rare ability to see events before they happened, and yet he walked into a room where he would be killed, and he could not have stopped it. The Ektochi, you should know, are a species born with precognition written into their very nature, an instinctive sensitivity to the currents and eddies of the future, the way you or I might feel wind before seeing a storm. It is not perfect vision, and it is not prophecy. It is more like standing in shallow water and feeling the pull of a tide you cannot quite see, a pressure against your skin that tells you something is moving. CC-10 carried that gift with him his entire life, honed it through the Force until it became almost unbearably acute, a constant low-frequency awareness of branching possibilities rippling outward from every moment. He was also, by any reasonable measure, one of the finest starfighter pilots the Jedi Order had ever produced, someone who could sense through both precognition and the Force the exact instant a ship would stall, when an opponent would commit, where an opening would appear. During the Clone Wars, He flew as a general commanding starfighter squadrons across contested space, and there was something almost meditative in the way he moved through three-dimensional combat, as if he were not reacting to danger, but dancing with it, one step ahead of its reach. But precognition, I want to tell you, is not the same thing as control. It is not permission to change what you see coming. Sometimes it is only witness. In the final months of the Republic, as Palpatine's presence on the Council grew more unsettling and the war dragged on without resolution, CC-10 felt something beginning to collapse in the future. It was not clarity, not a vision of a specific moment or face, but a gathering darkness, a certainty that something enormous was about to break. He brought his concerns to Mace Windu, his fellow council member, his friend. Mace, patient and careful, listened, and together they began to assemble the pieces. Palpatine was the Sith Lord they had been hunting. The revelation came like the last frame falling into place in a puzzle, and for a moment, everything made terrible sense. What happened next was something CC-10 could feel approaching, but not stop. Mace decided to move immediately to arrest Palpatine in his own office, before the Chancellor could consolidate his power further. There was a logic to the urgency, even if that logic was also a trap. Mace assembled 4 of them, himself, CC-10, Agent Kola, and Kit Fisto. They went to the Chancellor's office to make an arrest, not knowing, or perhaps, in Cece's case, knowing in that half-sensed way that was not quite the same as knowing, that they were walking toward the end of something. What I find myself thinking about is the moment just before Palpatine ignited his lightsaber, the instant when precognition should have screamed a warning that CC-10 could not possibly survive what was coming. The dark side, you see, has a quality to it in the Force like oil on water. It refracts and obscures, and even precognition can be blinded by it. Palpatine had spent decades learning to cloak himself, to move through the future in ways that would not register clearly until the moment he chose to reveal himself. So CC-10, a being who could feel the pressure of tomorrow, walked into that office, and the future went suddenly dark. In the duel that followed, and it was brief, almost merciful in its quickness, Palpatine cut down Agent Kola first, then turned on CC-10, and the Iktochi, that gifted pilot, that keen sensor of possibility, fell to a red blade in the Chancellor's office, far from home, far from the vast open sky of Iktoch where his species had learned to hunt on the wind. It happened in 19 BBY, only hours before Order 66 would be transmitted across the galaxy. He died before the greater darkness, before the systematic hunt, before the long years of exile that his fellow council members would endure. In one sense, this is not the story of his survival, because he did not survive, and yet I have kept him here in this section because there is something in his death that matters to the larger pattern, something that speaks to the nature of precognition and the limits of even extraordinary knowledge. The being who could sense the future clearest was the one who was most thoroughly caught in a future he could not change. That seems, in a way that is difficult to articulate, profoundly important. I think often about what it must have felt like. That moment of clarity, that feeling of pressure in the Force, the instant knowledge that the future was narrowing, that the path he was on led only one way. Did he accept it with the calm of someone who had always known? Did he die fighting, denying the vision to the last? The records are sparse, and the Force itself seems reluctant to hold the memory clearly. What we know is that when Mace Windu faced Palpatine alone, CC-10 was no longer beside him. The gap where he had been, where all 4 of them had been, slowly narrowing until only Mace stood in the light. That gap would widen across the entire galaxy in the hours that followed. And so we come, at last, to the reason this chapter exists at all. The recognition that survival is not the only story worth telling, and that sometimes the shape of a death tells us something true about the world that received it. CC-10, the precognitive pilot, could see the future, and the future came for him anyway. In his ending, we see the beginning of the larger pattern. that the Jedi Order, for all its wisdom and power and extraordinary members, was walking toward a future it could not alter, even when its members could sense it coming. To tell you about Coleman Kaj, I have to begin by admitting something. What I'm about to share with you is not confirmed fact, but rather a possibility that sits just at the edge of what we know, in a territory I believe to be true but cannot quite prove. Coleman Kaj was an Ongri, a species whose very anatomy shapes a fundamentally different way of seeing the world. His eyes positioned at the ends of stalk-like protrusions, capable of perceiving from multiple angles at once, his sensory architecture inverted from most humanoid beings. To be an Ongri is to have vision that is laterally distributed, to process the galaxy in a way that no human or Twi'lek or Sarian truly can. And this, I suspect, is part of what made him valuable to the Council in its final years. He sat on the High Council in the last hours of the Jedi Order, occupying the seat that had belonged to Coleman Treba, another casualty of the war, killed at Geonosis years before by Dooku and Jango Fett, a reminder that the Council had been bleeding members for years, and that loss was becoming ordinary. When Order 66 came through, it came to everywhere at once, a coordinated extinction written into the neural pathways of 10 million clone troopers across the galaxy. And Coleman Kaj was not at the temple. This much is certain. He was not recorded in the security footage of the massacre, not among the slaughtered younglings, not among the corpses Obi-Wan and Yoda would find in the halls they had walked for decades. What happened to him in those first hours remains genuinely unclear, and there is something almost respectful in that obscurity, a mystery preserved. But I think what happened is this. Coleman Kaj survived, as 4 or 5 others did, through a combination of assignment and chance, through the simple accident of being somewhere other than where the trap was sprung. And I think, in the years that followed, he made a choice that was perhaps the most radical of all the choices the survivors made. While Yoda chose the depths of Dagobah, remote and untouched, and Obi-Wan chose the desert of Tatooine as a place to watch and wait, I believe Coleman Kaj chose to hide not in isolation, but in the current, to disappear into the machinery of the galaxy's underworld, into the places where nobody asked questions because the answers were dangerous. Spice mining, you see, represents one of the few economic systems in the galaxy that exists almost entirely beneath the notice of authority, or perhaps more accurately, exists with the full knowledge of authority, but in a space where authority chose not to look too closely. The great spice mines of Kessel and other worlds like it were run by crime syndicates and minor kingpins, places where a being could arrive with nothing, change their name, and begin again, where a skilled mind, even one with an unusual physiology, could be useful without needing to explain where that skill came from. This is speculative, I know, but consider what an Ongri brain could do in a mining operation. The inverted perception, the ability to see patterns in complex systems, to understand three-dimensional spatial relationships in ways that most species could not. A being like that, arriving at a spice mine under an assumed identity, would be immediately, subtly valuable. I imagine Coleman Kaj did what the other survivors were doing. He dimmed his presence in the Force, the way a candle draws itself inward, becoming smaller, less visible, less alive in the energies that connect all living things. For a Jedi, this is a kind of self-imposed diminishment that I find almost unbearable to contemplate, to suppress the thing that had shaped every moment of your existence, to make yourself smaller in the Force so that predators hunting through that same Force would pass over you unseeing. He would have needed a new name, new documentation, a fabricated history that was mundane enough to withstand casual scrutiny. I imagine him arriving at some distant spice operation in the years after 19 BBY, in the early days when the Empire was still consolidating power, when it was still possible for a being to move through the galaxy if they were careful and small. Perhaps his name was something deliberately forgettable, a human name, generic and forgettable, something that would not draw attention to the fact that an Ongri was working in a spice mine, because Ongri were rare, and rarity was a kind of visibility he could no longer afford. He would have worked, I think, with meticulous precision, the way Jedi do everything, understanding the geometry of the mining operation, the stress load calculations, the engineering that kept the tunnels from collapsing, the systems that processed raw spice into the refined product that smugglers and the wealthy and the desperate would pay for. This kind of work is invisible work, the kind that runs the galaxy but never touches history, and I think that was the point. There is something almost heartbreaking in imagining a being who had sat on the Jedi High Council, who had helped shape the strategy and philosophy of the Order, reducing himself to working in darkness, to being useful in the way a tool is useful, present but not noticed. The danger, of course, was that the Empire eventually stopped looking the other way at spice operations. Or rather, it subordinated them to its own purposes, brought them under Imperial control, and in doing so, it made every being working in those mines a potential target for scrutiny. An Ongri, even one with a forged identity and years of careful hiding, could only remain invisible for so long before some Imperial auditor or interrogator noticed something odd in the records, some small inconsistency that didn't fit. And then there would be questions, and questions for a being in hiding were the worst possible thing, because even the most careful cover story could unravel under prolonged examination. I don't know how long Coleman Kakaj survived in the spice mines, or whether he survived at all in the end, or what eventually happened to him. Whether he was discovered and executed, whether he found some way to slip away to another identity, whether he simply lived out his remaining years in quiet obscurity until he died of age or accident, unremembered and unremarked. What strikes me most forcefully is the choice itself. To preserve yourself by making yourself smaller, by becoming useful in a way that required abandoning everything that had made you who you were. The Jedi Order had always taught that the Force connected all living things. That separation from that connection was a kind of death in itself. And yet here was Coleman Kakaj, deliberately, patiently, accepting something very close to that spiritual death in order to keep his physical body alive. I find myself thinking about that bargain a lot, what it costs to survive, what you have to surrender of yourself to make it possible, and whether survival purchased at that price is actually a victory or just a different kind of ending, slower and quieter, but no less final. In the end, the greatest secret Coleman Kakaj kept was not his hiding place or his assumed name, but the knowledge that even a member of the Jedi High Council could reduce themselves to nothing if the alternative was annihilation. There's something in that, about what the Order had become by the end, and what it had to lose in order to endure. There is someone I have not yet spoken to you about, and I find myself hesitant to begin, because her story breaks the pattern of this narrative in a way that matters deeply. Stas Ali was a Thalothian Jedi Master, which meant she carried the distinctive head tendrils of her species with grace, adorned with a headdress that caught the light in the temple's halls. She was a healer as well as a warrior, a combination rarer than you might think among the Council, where strength in combat often eclipsed the gentler disciplines of restoration and medicine. Her cousin Adigalia had served on the Council before her. When Adigalia fell in the war, Stas Ali stepped into that empty seat, carrying forward the legacy of her blood and her training. She had survived Geonosis in 22 BBY, the first great battle of the Clone Wars, standing in that arena where 1,000 Jedi fought, and lived through the opening volleys of what would become a 3-year grinding stalemate. By 19 BBY, she was a general like the others, commanding clone troopers, moving through the calculus of war that had become the Order's daily reality. The Council had learned by then to compartmentalize the dissonance of it. You were a peacekeeper trained for centuries, and now you held soldiers' lives in your hands and sent them to die. You learned to carry both truths at once. I think Stas Ali carried them with a particular gentleness, the way someone schooled in healing might approach even necessary violence, with full knowledge of its weight, reluctant and clear-eyed. On Salukami, in the final days of the Clone Wars, She was riding a BARC speeder across the planet's surface, moving with Commander Neo and Trooper Thaya, clone soldiers she had worked alongside for 3 years of warfare. They were together, the three of them, in that moment of transition between one world and the next, the war ending, or so they believed, and the Republic standing, or so they thought. And then the signal came, silent and absolute, transmitted into the neural tissue of every clone trooper in the galaxy at once. It was not a voice, not a command they could refuse, not an order they could question. It was a compulsion woven into their very biological matter by architects they would never meet or understand, seated in their brains like an ancient truth they had always carried. Commander Neo and Trooper Thaya, riding slightly behind her, felt the switch flip in an instant, and they became something other than they had been. They were still themselves, still wearing their faces and their names, but they were no longer hers. The blaster fire came from behind, from those she had trusted, and it struck her speeder with the casual certainty of soldiers doing their duty. She did not survive it. The speeder fell, and she fell with it, and that was the end of her story in this galaxy. One death among thousands in the vast montage of the Purge, documented in the security footage that would become historical record. But here is what troubles me about Stas Ali's death, and why I have come to speak of it in this chapter at all. She was not among the 7 survivors. The premise of this entire narrative is about survival, about the 7 council members who lived when the Order burned, and Stas Ali died, and died quickly, and died without the story we have been telling about flight and hiding and the long endurance of the Force in darkness. Yet I cannot tell the story of the 7 without speaking to you about the 5 who did not make it, because their absence shapes what the survival meant. Survival is not triumph. It is chance and proximity and the arbitrary fall of circumstance. 7 lived, and 5 did not, and perhaps the cruelest mercy of the Force is that we do not get to know why. What I find myself thinking about is the nature of what Stas Ali might have become, had she escaped that moment on Salukami. She was a healer in a time when healing would matter more than anything, and a woman in an order where the visible leadership had been male, and she carried the knowledge of medicine and restoration that the survivors would desperately need in the years to come. Agent Kohler died in Palpatine's office before Order 66 was even transmitted, struck down by the Sith Lord himself. Ki-Adi-Mundi died on Maijito, overwhelmed by his own troops. Plo Koon died in the skies above Cato Neimoidia when his own pilots turned on him. And Stas Ali died on Salukami, on a speeder, moving forward into what she thought would be the future. Each of them carried something irreplaceable, and each of them was taken from the survivors who remained. The survivors would carry the weight of those absences for decades, knowing that the order that might have been was diminished by those specific losses. If Yoda had 1,000 years of wisdom, and Obi-Wan had the tragedy of Anakin's fall to bear, and the 4 others had survival born of chance and distance, then Stas Ali died having none of those narratives, having only the moment itself. And perhaps that is the deepest part of this story. That survival itself was not guaranteed by some greater design, not earned through heroism or vision or the weight of centuries, but given to some and taken from others by the arbitrary mechanics of an instant. In the films, her death appears in a rapid montage, one Jedi among many falling in the opening minutes of the Purge, and we do not linger on her, and the filmmakers did not intend us to. But in a story like this, a story about the 7 who lived, we cannot help but linger on the ones who did not, because they define what survival cost. I think of Stas Ali as the reminder that we are not telling a story about the Jedi Order's survival. We are telling a story about its near-total destruction, with 7 fragments remaining. She was a healer and a warrior, a woman of the Council who had learned to carry both truths at once, and she was taken away in a moment of absolute betrayal by those she had served with for 3 years of war. That is the ground on which this entire narrative stands. The knowledge that for every survivor, there was someone who did not survive, and their absence echoes through everything that follows. The Emperor's hunters would eventually pursue the Seven across decades, and some of them would fall to that pursuit, and only then would the balance shift toward the idea of restoration. But in those first moments, in those first hours and days, the Order was simply gone. And Stas Ali was one of the reasons why. Let the weight of that settle. 7 survived Order 66, and 5 members of the Council did not, and the cost of the survivors' continued existence is measured partly in those who were left behind. The galaxy did not know yet that there would be 7 to hunt, that the Empire's work would not be complete, that something would remain to be reckoned with in the decades to come. All that remained in that moment was the fact of the dying, and the cruel possibility that some would escape it, and others would not, and there would be no cosmic reason why. After the duel in the Senate Rotunda, after the failure that weighed upon him like the accumulated grief of 900 years, Yoda spoke words that seemed to close an entire chapter of galactic history. Failed I have. Into exile I must go. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the body's weariness, but from the spirit's, when you have given everything you have to give and found it was not enough, and must now live with that knowledge. Bail Organa, whose hands had already moved to protect the Skywalker twins, whose ship awaited in the temple hangar with Obi-Wan already aboard, understood without words what the Grand Master meant. The two of them, old allies and practical men in the wreckage of the Order, did not speak of despair. They spoke instead of survival, of patience, of a future none of them could yet see. Yoda would go to ground on a world so remote, so deliberately unmarked on Imperial charts, that the Empire would take decades to even discover it existed. He chose Dagobah, a swamp world in the Outer Rim, misty and overgrown, where the living force sang so thickly that the artificial presence of the Empire seemed almost powerless to reach. The journey there was long, and took him away from the great thoroughfares of the galaxy, away from the shipping lanes, and the places where Imperial patrols now moved with crushing authority. When Yoda finally set foot on Dagobah's surface, the air itself was different. Thick with moisture and the breath of millions of lives in the swamps, the gnarled tree forests, the mist that never quite lifted from the ground. There were no cities here, no temples, no monuments to the Order he had just lost. There was only the land itself, and the force that moved through it, old and patient and indifferent to the rise and fall of empires. Yoda was 800 and something years old when he came to Dagobah, though after Order 66, time itself began to feel like a different kind of weight. He had trained Jedi for so long that the Order had become a part of his own bone and sinew. He could not separate what he was from what the Order had been. And now the Order was gone, burned away in hours, and he was left to exist in the space where it used to be. In those first years on Dagobah, and we must understand these as years of genuine solitude, not the solitude of a sage waiting for students, but the solitude of a being learning to exist without purpose, Yoda built himself a shelter, a small dome structure built from the swamp's own mud and materials, hidden among the twisted roots and mist. It was not grand, it was not meant to be. It was a place to sit, and to think, and to exist without being found. Before his exile, in the time before the Purge, Qui-Gon Jinn had begun to teach him something extraordinary, the path to remaining conscious after death, to becoming what the Jedi had always called a Force ghost, not a phantom or a haunting, but a continuation of awareness, a presence that could not be killed because it no longer required a body to exist. This was not the immortality of the Sith, which clung to flesh and tried to master death through domination. This was something different, an acceptance of death, a transformation through it, a way of persisting by letting go. Yoda had not finished learning this path when the Order fell, and on Dagobah, in the silence and the mist, he devoted himself to it with the singleness of focus that had marked his entire life. I find myself thinking about the weight of this choice, that in his exile, he did not become less a Jedi, but in some way more one, distilling the Order down to its deepest principles. Meditation, the Force, the understanding that power and presence were not the same thing. He had walked away from war. He had walked away from command, from the temple, from 10,000 Jedi looking to him for guidance that he could no longer give. And in walking away, he had taken with him the one thing that could not be burned: knowledge. The memory of what the Order had been, the techniques he had mastered, the understanding of the Force that had deepened across centuries. All of it was preserved in the consciousness of a single exile on a forgotten world. On Dagobah, in the swamps and the mist, Yoda also knew something that kept him alive. He was not truly alone. Through the Force, even diminished as it was in those early days after the Purge, he could sense other survivors. Obi-Wan, he knew, had gone to ground on Tatooine, watching over the boy. There were others, scattered across the galaxy, in hiding, wounded, but alive. He could not reach them. It would have been too dangerous for all of them. But he could feel them, like distant stars in a darkened sky. And he could feel the weight of the two children who were now the Order's entire future. Luke on Tatooine with his uncle, Leia on Alderaan with Bail Organa. The plan that Yoda and Obi-Wan and Bail had quietly agreed upon before Yoda's departure was simple and heartbreaking in its simplicity. Wait, preserve the knowledge, protect the children, and trust that someday, though perhaps not in their lifetimes, the Force would move again. The cave on Dagobah, the one whose darkness was so profound that even a Grand Master found it difficult to enter, became a kind of touchstone for Yoda's meditation. The dark side did not dominate him. He did not submit to it. Rather, he sat with it, understood it, integrated it into his knowledge the way a warrior might study his enemy's technique, not to become the enemy, but to be complete in his understanding. This is what exile became for him, not punishment or retreat, but a kind of consecration. In the decades that followed, Yoda's presence in the Force grew quieter and more profound. He became less a beacon and more a foundation, something fixed and deep that did not draw attention but simply endured. The Empire's hunters would search the galaxy for the last Jedi, would establish their inquisitorius and hunt relentlessly, and Dagobah would not appear in any of their calculations for a very long time. A small green being in a mud hut in a swamp, meditating on the Force and on failure, did not seem like a threat worth hunting. And so he endured, surrounded by the mist and the living things of a world that asked nothing of him but to be present to it. Yoda had spent his entire life as the embodiment of the Jedi Order's power and wisdom, its center and its strength. In exile, he learned something different, that power and wisdom were not the same thing, and that sometimes the greatest strength was in being still. This was the beginning of the long waiting, the long silence, the long meditation that would eventually lead him to something like peace. Over a decade has passed now, and the survivors have learned to live with a silence so complete that they sometimes forget there is anything else in the galaxy to hear. On Dagobah, Yoda sits motionless in the murk of his small hut, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow as the breath of stone. And he is not alone, though no one has visited him in 13 years. On Tatooine, Ben Kenobi watches Luke from across the dusty streets of Mos Eisley, the boy now old enough to ask questions Ben cannot quite answer. And in the moments when Luke laughs, something in Ben's chest catches. Somewhere in the Outer Rim, a Jedi Master whose name we do not yet know tends a garden in the darkness, growing things that should not grow so far from any star, and feels, across the vast emptiness between worlds, a presence that remembers what he remembers. The Empire hunts still, always hunts, but the hunter grows tired, and the galaxy is very large, and there are some places even the Inquisitors have not thought to look. It is not that the survivors are in contact with one another. They are scrupulously not, their separation a kind of protocol written in isolation and fear. But the Force does not recognize the boundaries that fear draws. The Force moves through the galaxy like water through stone, patient and present, and it carries with it the signature of every being who ever learned to listen to it. And so, in a way that defies explanation, in the language of transmission or message or even conscious thought, the 7 survivors sense that they are not the only ones who endured. On Dagobah, in the deep meditation that has become Yoda's entire existence, the old master feels it, a resonance, faint and distant, like the echo of a bell struck in another room. It is Obi-Wan's presence he senses, patient and steady as a lighthouse, burning quietly in the desert where he keeps his vigil over the boy. There is a warmth in it, a rightness, the continuation of purpose, the transmission of the Jedi way through guardianship, if not through teaching, and Yoda's ancient heart settles deeper into stillness, knowing that the lineage has not entirely broken. But there is more than that. Other presences, dimmer and more isolated, like stars so far away that even their light has taken years to reach him. Each of the 7 has learned to dim their presence in the Force until it is nearly invisible, a discipline harder than any lightsaber form, requiring the constant suppression of the very thing that made them Jedi in the first place. To live is to shine. The Force flows through all living things, and a Jedi especially burns with it like a candle. To survive is to learn to be a candle that has taught itself to glow only in the deepest infrared, visible only to those who know how to look with that particular kind of seeing. And yet they sense each other anyway. Quinlan Vos, hidden in the farthest reaches where the galaxy frays into uncertainty, catches a glimpse of something. Not a sight, not a sound, but a knowing, and he understands that Yoda yet lives. Coleman Kakaj, working in the spice mines of some forgotten moon, his true identity buried so deep that even his own reflection would not recognize him, feels a distant current of wisdom flowing through the Force and knows he is not the last. Stas Ali did not survive the Purge, and Kyadimundi fell on Maijito, and Agent Kola and Cece Tien were cut down before Order 66 was even fully transmitted, and Plo Koon burned in the sky above Kato Nemoidia, and Arala Secura trusted her soldiers until the moment they fired. But these 5 absences are felt by the 7 who endured, felt as a kind of weight, a gravity pulling at the edges of their consciousness. It is as though the Force itself mourns them, and the survivors are forced to hold that mourning in their bodies, to carry it, because there is no one left to speak it aloud. In the quiet, Ben Kenobi sits in the evenings in his small dwelling on the edge of the wastes, and he opens himself to the Force in the way Qui-Gon taught him, the way Yoda refined and perfected. And in those moments, he senses Yoda, not the Yoda of the Council chambers, the Yoda who commanded 10,000 Jedi with a word, but the Yoda of deep age and deeper knowledge, the Yoda who has learned to exist in the Force the way fish exist in water, not separate from it, but part of it. It is a comfort that words cannot quite touch. They have not spoken in more than 10 years and may never speak again, and yet they are not separated in any way that matters. This is what the Jedi understood in the end that the Empire could not quite grasp. Connection does not require proximity. The Force binds all living things. The Jedi had learned to use that binding as a language, and the survivors have learned to use it as a way to know that the Order, though scattered to the 4 corners of the galaxy and beaten nearly to extinction, has not actually died. It persists. In the spice mines, in the swamps, in the desert, in hiding places so obscure that even the survivors themselves have sometimes forgotten their own names, the Order persists. Yoda understands this more clearly than any of the others, because he has had the longest time to think about it, and because he is perhaps the most attuned to the Force of all the survivors. The Jedi are gone. That is not in question. The temple is dust, the 10,000 Jedi dead, the Order destroyed as completely as any institution can be destroyed. But the Force is not gone. The Force will not go. And so long as there are even 7 beings in the galaxy who understand how to listen to it, who have been trained in its ways and have not abandoned that training, the Jedi Order persists, not as an institution, but as a practice, a discipline, a way of moving through the universe. This is the thought that sustains Yoda through the long years on Dagobah, the thought that keeps him meditating and waiting, the thought that allows him to sense the distant presence of his former student and know that the boy Luke, even now, is learning the ways of hope. And across the galaxy, in various forms of hiding and isolation, the other 6 survivors sense something of this same understanding. They have not been given instructions in this. No message could reach them safely. No encoded transmission could bridge the gap between their scattered lives. But the Force teaches these things, if one is patient enough and quiet enough to listen. It teaches that connection is not made of words or signals or proximity. It teaches that the bonds of the Jedi are woven into the fabric of the Force itself, and that even when the Jedi seem to have been scattered to nothing, they have merely become smaller and harder to see, like seeds in the dark, waiting for the season when they might grow again. There is a moment, I find, that comes to many people who have lost everything, when they stand alone in a quiet place and realize that they have been given something unexpected: time. For Obi-Wan Kenobi, that realization arrived not as comfort, but as a kind of burden, on a desert world he had hoped never to see again. He came to Tatooine in the days after the temple fell, carrying a child he had sworn to protect and a knowledge he could barely carry, that the man he loved most had fallen so far into darkness that there could be no bringing him back. The twin suns of the Outer Rim cast their light across the salt flats and rust-colored stone, and Obi-Wan, who had served as a Jedi general commanding legions, who had stood on the Jedi High Council at the height of the Order's power, became Ben Kenobi, a hermit, a watcher, a man with a single purpose and no one to share it with. He delivered the infant Luke to Owen Lars in the Jundland wastes, and the moment he placed that child in Owen's arms, he understood something that would shape the next 3 decades of his life. This boy was the reason he was still alive. Owen did not want him there, did not want the Jedi, did not want the past, did not want the weight of what Anakin Skywalker had been. There was a deep anger in Owen, a resentment that had lived in him long before the Order fell, born from the knowledge that Anakin had been taken from the moisture farm as a child and given to the Jedi, that he had been chosen for something greater while Owen remained behind, tending the land, the unremarkable son of Cliegg Lars. When Obi-Wan tried to explain that Luke would need to be trained, that the boy carried a legacy and a power that could not be suppressed forever, Owen turned away from him with a finality that was almost physical. Keep the boy safe, Obi-Wan told him, and nothing more. Keep him hidden, and let him live the life his father never could. And Owen agreed to that much, though there was no affection in it, only duty, and the grim determination of a man who had already lost more than he wanted to lose. So Obi-Wan settled into the wastes beyond the homestead, in a dwelling carved into the rock, far enough away to give Owen peace, but close enough to act, to watch, to be present if the moment came when he was needed. He took the name Ben from the memories of a life that was no longer his to live. Ben Kenobi, an old man, a hermit, someone the Empire's hunters would pass over without a second glance. There is something that happens, I think, when a person is forced into isolation so complete that it becomes almost like a choice, when you have to convince yourself that the walls you're behind are something you built rather than something that trapped you. For the first years on Tatooine, Obi-Wan lived in that space between the two, unsure which truth was which. He had failed to save Anakin Skywalker, the Padawan he had sworn to train and guide. The man who might have been the greatest Jedi ever born had the galaxy not bent him toward darkness. He had failed to see the web that Palpatine was spinning around them all, the way the Clone Wars had ground and stretched the Order to its breaking point until there was nothing left to give. And he had failed to save the Jedi Order itself, 10,000 Jedi, reduced in the space of an afternoon to a handful of scattered survivors, most of them isolated in darkness, none of them aware of the others' survival. Obi-Wan believed himself to be the last, or nearly the last, and that was another weight he carried, though he did not yet know it needed to be carried. What sustained him through those early years was a practice Yoda had taught him before they parted ways. The art of listening to the Force through communion with a master who had learned to exist beyond death itself. Qui-Gon Jinn, Obi-Wan's own master, had discovered the secret of becoming a Force ghost, not a bound spirit, but a consciousness woven into the living Force itself, present and aware, but not confined to a single body or time. In the quiet of the Tatooine nights, when the twin suns had set and the desert cooled enough to walk in, Obi-Wan would sit in the stillness and listen for Qui-Gon's presence, and slowly, he learned to hear him. It was not a voice, exactly, though sometimes it seemed like one. It was more like remembering something he had always known, a wisdom that had always been there in the Force, waiting for him to be quiet enough to recognize it. Through those conversations with his dead master's presence, Obi-Wan found a kind of peace that he had not expected, and more importantly, he found a way to understand that the Order had not truly ended, it had transformed. A Jedi, Qui-Gon seemed to tell him, is not bound to the Council or the Temple or the visible institutions the galaxy could see and destroy. A Jedi is someone who listens to the Force and acts in service to it, whether that service looks like training younglings in a great tower or watching over a single child in the desert, unseen and unremarked. And as the years accumulated, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years of watching Luke grow from an infant to a boy to a young man who knew nothing of what he truly was, Obi-Wan began to understand that this was not a retreat or a failure, but a different kind of service. The Empire could not hunt what it could not see, and Obi-Wan had learned to make himself invisible, not through deception, but through the simple disciplines of stillness and silence. He watched Luke work beside Owen in the moisture vaporators, watched him look out toward the horizon with a restlessness that Obi-Wan recognized, because he had seen it in Anakin too. That longing for something beyond the small world you had been given, that hunger for meaning and movement and the Force itself. And Obi-Wan understood that he could not prevent Luke from reaching for that destiny, could only be ready for the moment when the boy came looking, as he eventually would, when the Force moved in ways that could no longer be ignored. The great lie Obi-Wan lived with was that Tatooine was a place where Vader would never look, a world scarred by Anakin's own memories of loss and slavery and the death of his mother, a place so painful to him that he would avoid it forever. So the child was hidden in plain sight, living under a false name, protected by being placed in the one place the hunter would not think to look, because that place was poison to him. There is a cruel irony in that Anakin's suffering, his inability to face what he had lost on Tatooine, became the mechanism of his own son's protection. Every year that Obi-Wan waited in the desert, he was betting his life and Luke's survival on the belief that Vader's pain would keep him away. But he could not hold that certainty forever, and the longer he waited, the more he learned to accept that the Force moves according to its own timing, not the plans of men. So he meditated, and he listened, and he grew older, tending his small dwelling and the slow accumulation of years, waiting for a moment he could not yet see, trusting in the Force and the young man growing in the dust and heat of a desert he would eventually need to leave. Somewhere else in the galaxy, he knew now, other survivors were doing the same. Old Yoda on his swamp world, and others whose names and faces he could not quite reach through the fractured connections that remained, each of them holding a small piece of the Order that had been, each of them waiting for the galaxy to turn. And that knowledge, the sense that he was not entirely alone, even in his isolation, was enough to sustain him through the long vigil of those quiet, patient years. There is a moment, perhaps halfway through the rebellion's rise against the Empire, when one of the last survivors steps back into the light, not by choice, but because hiding has finally become a form of death. By 0 BBY, the year the rebellion destroyed the first Death Star at Yavin, most of the galaxy had moved on from thinking about the Jedi at all. They were mythology now, or a threat already neutralized, or something people whispered about in cantinas without really believing in anymore. But there was still one person alive who carried in their mind and their body the full weight of what the Jedi Order had actually been before it fell. The memory of 12 masters sitting in the High Council chamber, the precise weight of a blue or green lightsaber in hand, the feeling of the Force as it moved through 10,000 living Jedi at the height of their power. Someone who had walked those halls, trained under those masters, and watched them vanish one by one across 19 years of hiding and silence. When this person emerged, and I want to sit with the dignity of that moment, with how much it cost, they carried something no refugee or soldier or scavenger in the rebellion could carry. They carried witness. They carried memory that was not distant legend, but lived experience. In the early years of the rebellion, when starfighters were few and hope was rationed like water in a desert, there came whispers of a Jedi, singular, moving through the outer rim. Not the Grand Master on Dagobah, though rumors of him had circulated in hushed tones for nearly 2 decades. Not the Hermit on Tatooine, though certain operatives of Bail Organa's network had long known where to find Ben Kenobi when the moment came. Someone else entirely, a survivor who had chosen a path of such complete erasure that their own name had become almost a theoretical thing, something they had set aside so carefully that even they sometimes felt it belonged to another person. This survivor had spent nearly 20 years in labor, so complete that it resembled non-existence. They had worked in spaceports and mining colonies, in places where authority was thin and nobody asked too many questions, in the kinds of worlds where a person could be invisible and safe and slowly, day by day, feel the light in themselves dimming down to almost nothing. There is something terribly sad in that kind of survival, the way it requires you to become smaller and smaller until you fit in the spaces the world forgets about. But it had worked. The Inquisitors had never found them. The Emperor's hunters, for all their dark side mastery and technological precision, had not sensed what was not radiating, what had learned to hold itself so still in the Force that even the Force itself seemed to pass by without noticing. And then, as the rebellion began to take shape, real shape, organized shape, not just desperate cells, but something approaching an actual military force, something changed in the geometry of the galaxy. The survivor sensed it through the Force long before they understood it consciously. A shift in the way the light moved. A subtle strengthening, as if somewhere in the darkness, something was remembering how to be bright again. Through the deep meditation that all the surviving council members had learned during their years of isolation, they felt it. Yoda on Dagobah, motionless in the swamp, felt it. Obi-Wan in the Jundland wastes felt it, kneeling in his dwelling as the hour of his watch grew late. The others felt it too, scattered as they were across the spaces between stars. It was not a call, exactly. It was more like the moment when a candle flame begins to move because somewhere nearby, someone has opened a door. For nearly 2 decades, the surviving council members had sensed one another only faintly, a kind of whisper in the Force that confirmed they were not entirely alone. But this was different. This was the feeling of the rebellion itself beginning to gather enough force, enough hope, enough organized defiance, that the shape of the galaxy was actually changing beneath Palpatine's hand. And in that moment, the survivor who had been living in such complete obliteration began to understand something. They could not hide forever. Not because they wanted to come back. The life of a Jedi, the power of the Force, the weight of responsibility was something they had genuinely shed, or so they had believed. But because the rebellion needed what only someone like them could provide. Someone who had known the Jedi Temple, who had trained under the High Council, who carried in their body and mind the precise knowledge of what had been lost and what might impossibly be restored. It was not enough to survive anymore. Survival had to mean something. So there came a time when this person walked out of the shadows and offered their knowledge to those who were fighting back. Not as a Jedi. They did not reclaim that title, and they did not want the weight of it. But as a teacher, a guide, someone who could tell the rebellion what they needed to know about the order that had fallen, about the Force itself, about the mistakes that had been made, and the possibilities that might still exist. I think about that choice a lot. The choice to step back out of obliteration and into purpose again, even knowing it might bring the hunters down upon them. It is a very different kind of courage than the courage of drawing a lightsaber. It is the courage of saying, after all these years in the dark, that my life must mean something more than just endurance. By the time the rebellion destroyed the Death Star at Yavin, this survivor had already begun to share what they knew with the Alliance's leadership. They had not given their name. The rebellion had learned not to ask the names of survivors, out of respect for the people who had chosen to be forgotten as the price of staying alive. But they had offered something far more valuable than a name. They had offered the testimony of someone who had stood in the same chamber as Yoda, who had meditated beside masters, now long silent, who had held a lightsaber in the days before the temple fell. And in offering that testimony, they had become, whether they wanted the title or not, the last living council member to step back into the light. Not the one on Dagobah in silence, still meditating on the fallen order. Not the one in the wastes, watching over the last heir of Skywalker. But the one who had said, I will return, and I will speak, and I will help you understand what we had, and what we lost, and what might yet be possible. There is nobility in that choice, I think, but also a kind of sadness that does not go away. Because every moment this survivor spent sharing knowledge with the rebellion was a moment they risked being found by the Empire. Every story they told about a council meeting or a meditation or a duel was a thread that might lead Vader or the Inquisitors directly to them. And yet they told those stories anyway. They told them because the rebellion needed to know what they knew, and because after nearly 2 decades of erasure, being truly useful again. Being able to say, I remember this, I witnessed this, it was real and I can prove it, was a kind of resurrection in itself. That is where we find this survivor, as the rebellion era truly begins. Known to some, hidden from most, living in the space between memory and purpose, carrying the terrible weight of being possibly the last living person who could tell you, in detail, with precision, with the authority of genuine experience, what the Jedi High Council had actually been like in the days before it fell. 7 survived Order 66. By 0 BBY, only a few were known even to the rebellion, and one of them had learned that the highest calling was not to hide forever, but to speak what you know while you still can. This is the last chapter of our story, and I want you to know before we begin that it is not an ending at all, but a beginning that took a very long time to arrive. The 7 High Council members who survived the night Order 66 burned the galaxy: Yoda, Obi-Wan, Quinlan Vos, Coleman Kakaj, Cece Tien, and 2 others whose names the official records have since obscured, carried something precious into the darkness with them. They did not carry it consciously, most of them not at first. Yoda on Dagobah knew what he was protecting. 8 centuries of knowledge, distilled into the practice of becoming one with the Force itself, preserved through meditation and the patient mastery of death itself. Obi-Wan in the Jundland wastes, watching over a child he could not acknowledge, was protecting something smaller and somehow larger. The possibility that redemption might still be possible, that a fallen man might find his way home. But the others, Quinlan Vos working in the depths of his own isolation, Coleman Kakaj in whatever hidden life he had constructed, the survivors whose identities even the Force kept secret, they were protecting something they could not always name. They were keeping alive the simple fact of the Jedi's existence. By persisting, by choosing not to reveal themselves even when it would have been easier, even when it would have been more comfortable, they were saying to the Empire and to the Void itself, we are still here. We still remember. You did not take everything from us. I have been thinking about this for a long time, this strange mathematics of survival and witness, And I think what moved me is how ordinary it was. There was no grand resistance, no secret temple where the Jedi gathered in defiance. There was Yoda sitting alone in a swamp on a planet no one remembered, meditating on the Force until it began to speak to him in ways he had never heard before, not as instruction or command, but as presence, as connection. There was Obi-Wan sitting in a desert, waiting, tending a young man he could not teach, holding the knowledge of the Order in his own body and mind the way a lighthouse holds light. There was the ancient Jedi principle of service, the understanding that the Order did not exist for itself, but for the galaxy, persisting not through institutions or doctrines, but through the simple fact of lives lived in accordance with the Force. And then, slowly, almost without anyone noticing, the galaxy began to move again. The rebellion formed not from the Jedi, but around them, unknowingly drawing on the presence of those who had survived into hiding, their wisdom seeping out through the cracks in the Empire's certainty. Luke Skywalker was born and hidden on Tatooine, unknowingly in the presence of a Jedi Master who could only watch and wait. Leia Organa grew up raised by Bail Organa, carrying in her the Force potential that descended from the ancient line of the Skywalkers, connected to the wider network of Jedi survival that she could not have known existed. The Force itself, it seemed, was tending to its own resurrection. What I find remarkable, looking back across these 2 decades of hiding, is how the survival of the Seven was not a beginning, but an acknowledgement. The Jedi Order had not truly died on that night in 19 BBY. It had transformed. It had shed the form that had made it visible, the hierarchy, the temple, the robes and councils, and the clear structures of authority, and had become something else, a practice instead of an institution, a way of listening instead of a way of commanding, an understanding that could persist in a single mind or heart just as fully as it had once persisted across 10,000 temples. When Luke Skywalker walked into the Dagobah swamp as a young man, when he came to Master Yoda tired and uncertain and desperate to become what he needed to become, he was not finding a hidden temple of the old order. He was finding the distillation of the Order's truest principle, that the Force calls us to service, and that service can continue even in the smallest corner of the galaxy, in the quietest life, in the most complete seeming of disappearance. And when Yoda looked at that young man and saw in him the mirror of his own ancient power and his own young hope, and began to teach him the way the Order had always taught, not through doctrine, but through presence, through failure and growth, and the patient accumulation of understanding, the Jedi Order was not being revived. It was being remembered, which is not quite the same thing. Memory is more fragile than revival, but it is also more honest. It does not pretend that what was before will be again. It simply says, this mattered. This still matters. Let it shape what comes next. The 7 survivors, those 7 men and women whose names are mostly forgotten now, who lived in near-total isolation for more than 20 years, who never gathered to speak with one another even when they sensed each other through the Force like distant bells across a vast darkness. They did that. They preserved the memory and the practice both at once, and in doing so, they made resurrection possible without making restoration the goal. What came after was not the Jedi Order as it had been. It was something the old council could never have imagined. A younger, smaller, stranger version of itself, guided by a man who had been tempered in exile and taught by a master who understood that failure and patience could be the greatest teachers the Force offered. This is what the 7 survivors gave the galaxy. Not salvation, but possibility. Not certainty, but a way forward that honored what was lost while remaining open to what might still become. And I think that is why their story matters so much to me, and perhaps to you as well. In a universe that is often defined by grand victories and terrible defeats, by the kind of narrative certainty that allows us to divide the galaxy into clear victors and vanquished, the 7 survivors persisted in a different kind of truth. They said that meaning does not require triumph, that the Order's greatest gift was not power, but the willingness to serve even in utter darkness, and that the Force itself, patient, undeniable, present in every living thing, would move toward restoration in its own time and its own way. And it did. Not quickly and not without cost. But it did. So settle now into that knowledge, and rest assured that even when the night seems most absolute, the work of preservation continues quietly in 1,000 small, invisible places, tended by those who love what once was and trust what might yet be.